Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Awakening Beneath the Scalpel's Edge. I was supposed to be home by 8. That was the plan. Anyway, get off work on time, grab some dinner from the deli near the station, and then slip inside my apartment before any of the usual night noise really kicked in. But things never work out the way you expect, especially in this part of town. The late shift at the hospital tended to drain me more than I anticipated. I'd spent 10 hours dealing with restless patients, barking orders, and the kind of small crises that never made it to the news. When my pager finally went silent, I locked my locker and stepped outside into the thick, humid air of early summer. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. Steam hissed from a grate nearby, the smell sharp and sour like burnt rubber. It was just after 8, and the city felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I walked toward the train station, my shoes clicking softly on the uneven concrete. The air smelled faintly of garbage left out too long and a faint trace of stale beer. Not exactly relaxing, but familiar. At the entrance to the platform, I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The breeze was mild but didn't carry away the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. Half a dozen people milled around, some scrolling on their phones, others just waiting in silence. I glanced at my watch. 8:12. That's when I noticed him. Standing near the ticket machines was a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't dressed like most of the regular commuters. His clothes were baggy, a threadbare hoodie pulled up over his head, casting shadows across his face. He had that kind of stillness that makes you uneasy, as if he were waiting for someone or something, but not quite. I turned away and headed down the steps to the platform, telling myself I was being paranoid. People wait for trains all the time. But my eyes kept flicking back to the man. He hadn't moved. The train arrived a few minutes later, screeching against the rails. I slipped inside, found a seat near the window, and pulled my backpack onto my lap. I tried to focus on the passing cityscape, the blur of storefronts, the occasional flicker of neon signs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When the doors slid shut, I looked up and saw the man at the edge of the platform. Our eyes met for a split second, and he didn't look away. I felt a jolt of something like panic, but I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was just waiting for a friend or another train. The next stop was only 3 stations away. It would be quick. The train rattled forward, and I finally turned my gaze out the window again. My reflection blurred with the dim lights inside the car. I could hear the soft murmur of other passengers, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels over the tracks. A few stops later, I noticed something new. The man had boarded the train. He walked slowly down the aisle, his hood still up, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket. The dim overhead light caught a glimpse of his face, a pale, gaunt outline, eyes shadowed but fixed straight ahead. He stopped a few feet away from me, just standing there as if deciding whether to sit or keep moving. I swallowed hard. My fingers tightened around the strap of my backpack. My heart started to race, but I told myself to stay calm. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't dangerous. But then he took a step closer. I shifted in my seat, trying to make myself small, hoping someone else would notice. The car was half full, but nobody else seemed to pay him any mind. The man's eyes flicked to mine for a moment, and then he sat down directly across the aisle. The air between us felt suddenly thick, like the space had shrunk. I could hear my own breathing, uneven and shallow, and the dull thud of my pulse in my ears. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check messages, but my hands trembled enough that the screen blurred. The man was watching me now, not quite staring, but definitely attentive. I tried to think. Should I move to another car? But the train was crowded enough that standing up would draw attention, and I wasn't sure if that would make things worse. The stop after that was supposed to be mine. I kept my head down, counting each station as it passed, willing the train to move faster. When the train slowed for the next station, I stood up quickly, stuffed my backpack on my shoulder, and moved toward the doors. The man stood as well, keeping pace a few steps behind me. My heart sank. At the platform, I hurried up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the tiled walls. I glanced over my shoulder. He was right behind me, still head up, following without hesitation. I broke into a run, pushing through the automatic doors into the street. The city felt different at night. The usual hum of traffic was punctuated by distant sirens and the occasional shout. I darted across the street, my breath ragged, eyes scanning for anything familiar, a group of people, a lit storefront, a taxi. A bus stop ahead was empty except for a woman sitting alone, staring at her phone. I ran past without looking back. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, fingers shaking, and saw a message from my roommate, "Lock the door, right?" I stopped, heart pounding. Of course I had. But the thought of someone following me made every shadow feel like a threat. I hailed a cab, hands fumbling with the button on the street. When the cab pulled over, I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and told the driver my address without looking back. The man stood on the corner, watching as the cab pulled away, his face still obscured by the hood. Inside the cab, the city lights streaked past the window. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see him running after us. The driver said nothing, focused on the road. When the cab reached my apartment building, I fumbled with the door key, my hands trembling so badly I dropped it twice. I locked the door behind me and bolted the deadbolt. The familiar smell of old carpet and dust didn't comfort me. I pressed my back against the door and slid down to the floor, breathing hard. I told myself I was safe for now, but the fact that I was still shaking told me otherwise. Somewhere out there, in the dark streets I thought I knew, someone had chosen me. And I didn't know why. Not yet. I had never been especially cautious before that night. I used to think paranoia was a waste of energy, something for people who watched too much television or read too many crime stories. But as I sat alone in the dim light of my apartment, I realized how easily reality could twist into something dangerous and unrecognizable. The day had started so normally, too normally, maybe. I'd worked a double shift at the diner down on 5th Street. It was the kind of job that left you physically drained but mentally numb, nothing exciting, just the clatter of dishes and the hum of the old jukebox playing classic rock in a loop. When I clocked out just after midnight, the streets were almost deserted. I liked that part, the quiet, the way the city seemed to exhale after the chaos of the day. I walked a few blocks to the train station, planning to catch the last subway home. I'd only been waiting 5 minutes when I noticed him. A man standing a few yards away, leaning against a brick wall under the flickering street lamp. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, hands stuffed deep into the pockets. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were always people hanging around late at night. But something about the way he shifted his weight, his gaze fixed not on the ground or the passing cars, but directly at me, made me tighten my grip on the strap of my bag. I tried to look away, to focus on the screen of my phone, but I could feel his eyes burning through the darkness. When our eyes finally met, he gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod, like he was acknowledging me in some secret way. I forced a neutral expression and turned my attention back to the train schedule, heart beginning to race. The sound of footsteps behind me made me jump. They were slow, deliberate, matching my pace exactly as I quickened my steps toward the entrance. I glanced over my shoulder. He was there, following me, keeping just enough distance to avoid being obvious but close enough that I could feel his presence. The streetlight above us buzzed and flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the cracked pavement. I pushed through the station doors just as the train pulled in. The doors slid open with a sharp hiss, and I slipped inside, pressing myself against the cold metal wall. I watched the man reach the entrance, hesitate, then step inside as well. My pulse thudded painfully in my ears. The train was nearly empty, just a few tired commuters scattered in the seats. The man chose a seat a few cars down, his face obscured in shadow, but I could see the way he turned his head slowly to watch me, his eyes never leaving mine. I debated getting off at the next stop, but the station was a desolate stretch of poorly lit streets. I wasn't familiar enough with the area to feel safe wandering around in the middle of the night. So I stayed put, gripping the pole beside me, every nerve screaming for me to do something, anything, while my mind raced through all the possibilities of who he was and why he was following me. The train clattered on, the rhythmic rumble and squeal of wheels on tracks a constant reminder of how trapped I was. I tried to call a friend, but my phone had just enough signal for the call to ring once or twice before cutting out. I swiped to text instead, fingers trembling as I typed a quick message, followed on the train. Feeling uneasy. Call me if I don't text back in 30 minutes. And then I hit send, praying it would go through. For a while, the man just sat there, silent and still. But then, as the train slowed near my stop, he stood up and started moving toward me. My breath hitched. Why was he coming over? I tried to steady my voice when he stopped beside me, his face inches from mine, too close. He barely whispered, "You dropped this." Then he held out a small, folded piece of paper. I stared at it, heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't want to take it, but something about the way he looked, there was a strange intensity, not quite threatening, but not friendly either, made me reach out. My fingers brushed his as I took the note. The paper was crumpled, stained with what looked like dirt or maybe old food, but I unfolded it carefully. Written inside, in block letters, was a single sentence, "I'm watching you." The words felt like a slap, cold and sharp. I glanced up, but he was already stepping back, melting into the shadows of the empty car as the train pulled into the station. Without another word, he disappeared through the doors just as they slid open. I didn't follow. I stayed on the train until the last stop, then sprinted the few blocks back to my apartment. The streets were still silent, but the air felt heavy, thick with tension. I locked the door behind me, checked every window, every bolt. The note sat on my kitchen table, a silent reminder that I was not alone, that someone was out there, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a sick joke from someone who had seen me at work or on my way home. But the fear that coiled in my stomach wasn't just from the note or the man on the train, it was the undeniable proof that my world had shifted. I was no longer just a face in the crowd. I was a target. I sat on the edge of my bed, the note clutched in my hand, and listened. The walls of my apartment felt thinner than ever, like they could be breached with a quiet knock or the scrape of a shoe on the landing. The hum of the city outside was distant and untrustworthy. I wanted to tell myself it would pass, that it was just a random encounter, nothing more. But deep down, I knew the nightmare was just beginning. I didn't mean to stay out as late as I did that night. I left work just after 8 p.m., grabbed a quick sandwich from the deli down the block, and planned to catch the 8:28 train home. The station was usually empty at that hour, which I liked, quiet, no crowds, but that night it felt off. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead gave the platform a sickly, uneven glow. I was the only person waiting, or so I thought. A man sat on the bench at the far end, his jacket pulled tight around him, collar up, head tucked low. I couldn't see his face clearly. He didn't move while I waited, just sat there, almost statue-like. The sound of the train approaching was a relief, but the man rose with me and followed at a distance as I moved toward the doors. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, not matching my pace but close enough to make me glance back twice before I managed to slip onto the car and press myself against the window. He stopped on the platform, watching, but didn't get on. The train ride was uneventful, the dim interior lights humming softly as the car rattled through the tunnels. I texted my boyfriend to tell him I was on my way, and he didn't reply. Usually, he'd say something quick, "See you soon" or "Drive safe." I shrugged it off. Maybe he was still at the bar with his friends. That's what I told myself. When I reached my stop, I stepped off and found the street unusually deserted. Usually, even on a weeknight, there'd be a few people walking, cars idling at corners, the dull noise of the city winding down. But now it was silent. The street lamps flickered in patches, some working, some dead. The light that did come through was weak, casting long shadows that made the cracked pavement look like a spider web. I pulled my coat tighter around me and headed down the block toward my apartment. The building was old brick and peeling paint, and the front door's buzzer was broken. I pulled out my keys, fumbled with the lock, and finally slipped inside. The lobby smelled like damp concrete and stale smoke. I took the stairs, avoiding the elevator. The smell in that cramped box always made me uneasy. On the third floor, the hallway was dim, the single bulb at the end flickering erratically. My apartment door was just opposite the stairwell. I pressed my key into the lock, and it turned slowly, almost sticking. Inside, everything was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the blinds. I flipped the light switch. Nothing. I tried again, harder. Still nothing. The power was out. I pulled my phone from my pocket and clicked the flashlight on. The beam swept across the room, revealing the usual clutter: books on the coffee table, a pair of sneakers left by the door, a jacket slung over the chair. But then I noticed something else. The window facing the street was wide open. I never left it open to the night air. It was too cold, and I was always careful about security. My heart thudded. I closed it with a snap, locking it down tightly. I scanned the apartment quickly. Nothing seemed moved. I sighed, probably left it open after the heat kicked off earlier. Still, the feeling of being watched settled in the pit of my stomach. I went to the fuse box in the kitchen to check the breakers. Flipping the main switch off and on didn't restore the lights. I called the utility company, but there was no answer, just an automated message about scheduled maintenance. Odd, since I hadn't gotten any notice. I sat down at the table, my phone's light dimming as the battery dropped. I was about to call my boyfriend again when I heard a soft noise coming from the hallway outside my door, a shuffling, maybe a scrape. I froze, straining to listen. The building creaked and settled, the wind rattling the windows. Then the noise came again. This time, a faint knock on the door. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? I called out, "Who is it?" My voice sounded thin, too high, unfamiliar even to me. No answer. Just silence. I edged to the door and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Empty hallway. The knock came again, softer this time, like a finger tapping lightly. I swallowed hard and stepped away. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but what would I say? That some stranger was knocking, but no one was there when I checked. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, more for comfort than defense, and sat back down, listening. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. Then, a noise from the back window, the one in the bedroom. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I heard the scrape of something moving against the frame. I got up slowly and edged toward the bedroom, holding the knife out in front of me. The window was closed this time, but the lock was broken, the latch hanging loose. Whoever had been here had tried to get in. Panic surged up my throat, choking and real. I backed away and locked the bedroom door. I texted my boyfriend again. No reply. I called a friend who lived nearby. She was out of town. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The building felt alive with menace. Every creak, every shadow seemed amplified. I sat in the dark, clutching the knife, trying to steady my breathing. The power didn't come back on. The knocking didn't return. But I knew this wasn't over. I spent the night on the couch, keys in one hand, phone in the other. When dawn finally crept through the blinds, I was still awake, exhausted but too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I called the building manager. He said no one else had reported break-ins or strange noises, but he promised to send someone to check the locks. I wanted to believe it would be okay, that the fear was just my imagination. But when I looked out the window later that day, I saw a man standing across the street, watching. The same man from the train platform. He looked up, met my eyes, and didn't look away. Then he turned slowly and disappeared around the corner. That was when I realized the nightmare wasn't done with me yet. I was driving home late, later than usual, because the office had been unbearably busy, and I wanted to get through the last of the reports before Monday. The highway was mostly empty, the hum of the engine and the faint static from the radio the only sounds inside the car. Outside, the night was cool and clear, and the streetlights stretched in a rhythm that had begun to lull me into a kind of half-focus. I was tired, but I wanted to get home, close the door behind me, and finally breathe. About 20 miles from the city, the road narrowed, winding through a strip of countryside I barely remembered from my childhood. I used to visit my grandparents here, but those trips were distant memories now. The houses here were sparse, mostly dark, save for one or two with porch lights on. The shadows the trees cast on the road made the yellow line seem like it was slipping beneath the wheels. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw headlights far behind me, bright but not too close. I figured it was just another car, another late returner like myself, nothing unusual. But as the miles ticked by, the headlights stayed at the same distance, matching my speed without overtaking. That was odd. Usually, someone would pass or fall behind. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was being paranoid. Then the car blinked its high beams at me. Once. Twice. I blinked, unsure if I'd imagined it. The road was empty except for me and that car. My heart picked up. I slowed down slightly, keeping steady. The car slowed too. Then it matched my speed again. I considered pulling off somewhere, maybe to a gas station or convenience store. But there was none for miles. Just a dark road and me. Another set of beams flashed rapidly. This time it was unmistakable. Someone was trying to get my attention, but I didn't know why. I didn't want to stop. I thought about calling the police, but I was too far out of town, and my phone signal was weak. The screen flickered with no service. I kept driving, eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The car stayed behind me, unyielding. After 5 more minutes, the highway opened into a small town. I breathed a little easier, thinking I could find safety or at least more people around. The headlights behind me disappeared for a moment, and I thought maybe the car had turned off. But then, just as I passed the first dim streetlight, the car pulled up behind me at the stop sign, so close I could see the driver's face in the mirror. A man, mid-30s, pale, with sharp eyes that seemed to hold something hard and cold. I forced myself to stay calm, pressing the gas gently when the light turned green. The car followed. I took the next right, then a left. The car took the same turns, never more than a few feet behind. My palms were sweating on the steering wheel, and my breath came in short bursts. I thought about the houses, the people I could run to, but it was nearly midnight. The streets were deserted. I pulled into a parking lot in front of a 24-hour grocery store, flicked on the interior light, and sat there, heart pounding. The car stopped directly behind me. I locked the doors and sat still, listening. The man stayed inside his vehicle, engine running, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed movement, a figure stepping out of the car, walking slowly but deliberately toward my door. I didn't dare unlock it. I grabbed my phone again. No signal. I tried the horn, but the sound felt weak in the night. The man was close now, close enough to see his expression clearly, a strange mixture of resolve and something unreadable. Suddenly, someone from inside the grocery store stepped outside, a man carrying a bag. The stranger by my car paused, turned, and walked back to his vehicle. The headlights started up again and the car pulled away, accelerating down the street. I sat frozen for a long time after he disappeared, willing my breath to slow, my hands to stop shaking. The relief was sharp but fragile. I didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. I started the engine and drove the rest of the way home, glancing nervously into the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the street was quiet, the porch light warm against the dark. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and sat on the floor against the wall, heart still pounding, the night's terror echoing louder than the silence around me. The shadows pressed close to the windows, shifting with the faintest breeze, as if the darkness itself was alive, waiting. I tried to steady my breathing, but every creak and whisper in the house felt like footsteps drawing nearer. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen cracked, but still my only lifeline. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? A man I didn't know watching me from the dark. It felt stupid, like inviting more terror into my fragile bubble of safety. Suddenly, the power flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into an oppressive blackness. I was alone. Or maybe I wasn't. A cold draft brushed past me, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic, blood, maybe? My heart pounded as I fumbled blindly for the flashlight app, every second stretching into an eternity. I had never felt so exposed as I did that night in the parking lot behind the grocery store on the edge of town. It was just after midnight, and the store was closed, but I'd stayed late to grab a few things I'd forgotten earlier. The sky was a dull black, heavy with clouds that swallowed the moon, and the lot was mostly empty except for a few cars scattered near the entrance and one shadowed silver sedan parked a little too close to the back door where I locked up my bike. I was tired, my body aching from a long day at the warehouse, and I just wanted to get home. The fluorescent bulbs over the parking lot flickered intermittently, casting patches of sickly yellow light on the cracked asphalt. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the lot toward my bike, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. I glanced around, noticing a man leaning against the silver sedan. He was tall, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild late summer air, and his face was mostly hidden beneath a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was just waiting for someone or maybe a night shift worker taking a smoke break. But as I reached my bike, I caught the scent of stale cigarette smoke mixed with something metallic like rust or oil. It was faint but unmistakable. I kept my voice quiet but steady, greeting him with a simple, "Hey." He didn't answer. He only straightened, tucking his hands into his pockets and watching me with an unnerving stillness. I swallowed hard, my heart picking up speed. There was something off about him, though I couldn't say exactly what. I swung my leg over the bike, attempting to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to remind myself that I lived in a small town where nothing truly bad happened, that this was probably just some guy looking for a friend or waiting for a ride. But as I pushed the pedals and started to move toward the edge of the lot, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the soft shuffle of the man by the car, but heavier, more deliberate steps, somebody running. I glanced back. The man was moving now, his stride quickening. I realized then how out of place his jacket was, too heavy for the temperature, and his movements were awkward, like he was trying not to draw attention but failing. Panic surged through me when I saw him pull something dark and rectangular from his jacket pocket. At first, I thought it was a phone, but then I realized it was a crowbar. The streetlights dipped in and out as my bike's tires rolled over uneven pavement, the sound lost beneath the pounding of my heart. I pedaled faster, the silver sedan now a blur behind me, and I kept looking over my shoulder to see the man closing the distance. The parking lot stretched wide and empty except for the few scattered vehicles, but the nearest roads were a good 5 minutes away on foot, and the entrances to the store were locked tight. My throat tightened, and I felt the cold sweat prickling at my neck as I realized how vulnerable I was, just me, on a bike, with nowhere to hide. The man was gaining. I could hear his breath now, ragged and uneven, and the scrape of his shoes against the asphalt. My legs burned, but I pushed harder, swerving toward the lot's only exit, hoping to reach the streetlights lining the main road where there might be passing cars, headlights cutting through the night. A sudden noise made me swerve sharply to avoid a garbage bin someone had toppled over. The scrape of tires and brakes far off made my heart slam against my ribs. A car was coming, headlights slicing the darkness. I yelled, waving my arms, desperate. The man hesitated, then stopped abruptly and disappeared behind the silver sedan like smoke. The headlights grew brighter, illuminating the lot in stark white light as the car rolled to a stop beside me. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, leaned over. "You okay?" he asked. Relief flooded me, and I nodded, panting. "I saw you sprinting out here. Thought someone might be after you." His gaze flicked toward the silver sedan where the other man had been standing. "No, I think so," I stammered. "There was a guy. He was following me." The driver nodded, frowning. "You want a ride? It's not safe around here, especially this late." I didn't hesitate. I dropped my bike and climbed into the passenger seat, the door shutting with a solid click that felt like a shield. The engine hummed as he pulled out onto the main road, and the silver sedan was nowhere in sight. For a moment, I let the tension drain out of my body. The driver was quiet, concentrating on the road, and the streetlights flashed past in rhythmic patterns. I caught my breath and tried to calm my pounding heart. But even in the safety of the car, I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, half hidden beneath that cap, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Do you want me to call someone?" the driver asked softly. "Police? Your family?" I shook my head. "No. Not yet. I just want to get home." He nodded, understanding. I stared out the window at the darkened houses and empty streets, knowing this was only a brief reprieve. Whoever that man was, he hadn't disappeared. He was still out there, and now I was certain he wasn't just waiting for a friend. He was waiting for me. Story 2, the unseen lie everyone believes. I had been working the midnight shift at the hospital for nearly 3 months. The ER was quieter than usual that night, which was not something I was used to or happy about. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat alone in the break room, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second echoing through the sterile room. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it, hoping for a few minutes of peace before my next round. Outside the window, the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few cars scattered here and there, headlights off, shadows barely shifting. The hospital was on the edge of town, the kind of place where streets started to thin, and darkness stretched toward the forest that edged the neighborhood. I had always liked it about this job, being on the border between the city and the wild, but tonight, the quiet felt wrong. When I finally gave in and checked my phone, There was a single text, no sender ID, just a series of numbers, 742. I frowned, wondering if it was some kind of mistake or an automated message. Then there was another, minutes later, 743. My skin prickled. I showed it to a nurse across the hall, but she just shrugged. Maybe a wrong number? I closed my phone and tried to focus on the paperwork I had left. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the hall, a slow shuffle that didn't quite match the usual scurry of hospital workers on their way somewhere. I looked up, but no one was in sight. The fluorescent lights flickered for a moment, and I thought I heard something, a low murmur just beyond the door. I told myself it was the ventilation system, or my imagination. But when I glanced at the security monitor on the desk, I saw a figure standing near the entrance to the ER. There was no name badge, no scrubs, just a dark jacket and a cap pulled low over the face. The person didn't move, they just stood there, looking in. I swallowed hard. The hospital doors locked at midnight, but there was a side door I had seen left ajar sometimes during busy shifts. Maybe someone had slipped in. I debated calling security but hesitated. What if it was just a late visitor or someone lost? Maybe the person was waiting for a ride. Minutes passed. The figure was still there. It was hard to tell if they were looking directly at the camera, but the way they didn't move felt deliberate, like they were waiting for something or someone. My heartbeat sped up, and I kept glancing at the door behind me, half expecting it to swing open. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. The screen showed unknown. I let it ring once, then silenced it. The call didn't come back. I told myself to stop overthinking. The hospital was a public place. Someone standing outside couldn't hurt me. But then my gaze drifted back to the monitor, and the figure was gone. I stood up, hands trembling slightly, and walked to the door leading to the main hall. The corridor was empty, eerily so. No janitors pushing carts, no distant voices of patients or doctors. I walked cautiously toward the entrance, eyes flicking to every corner. The door was locked, just as it should have been. I moved to the side door. It was closed, but the lock looked like it had been tampered with, scratches in the metal, the latch hanging loosely. A cold wave rolled through my chest. I pulled out my phone and dialed the hospital security line. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. I sent a text message to a coworker on the day's shift, but the message didn't deliver. My hands were shaking now, and sweat started to bead on my forehead despite the cool air conditioning. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe the power was out in the security office. Maybe the phone lines were down. I had to get someone, anyone, to come check. I went back to the break room and sat down, trying to steady my breath. Then I heard it, soft tapping, like fingernails brushing against glass. I froze. It was coming from the window behind me, the one that looked out over the parking lot. I turned slowly. Outside, the faint light of a street lamp revealed the outline of the same figure. No cap this time, but the face was still obscured by shadows, head tilted slightly, watching me. My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Then a voice, barely above a whisper, tearing through the glass, "Let me in." I slammed my hand against the glass, the sound sharp and loud in the silent room. The figure stepped back into the darkness. I backed away to the door, fumbling with my phone again. The call finally went through. I managed to explain the situation before the line went dead. No response. I called again, dread settling deep in my bones. Behind me, I heard the side door creak open. I spun around, heart hammering. The corridor was empty. but the door was ajar. I gripped my phone tightly and stepped toward the door, every nerve screaming to run. The hospital felt like a cage, the walls closing in. Outside was the night, black and endless, but inside, something worse was waiting. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the shadows beyond the door. The phone buzzed again with another text, 7:44. I didn't reply. The night I started feeling watched, I was just trying to get through my shift at the diner without losing my mind. It was close to midnight when I locked up the register and leaned against the counter, waiting for the last of the customers to clear out. The air smelled of burnt coffee grounds and fried grease, heavy and thick, like it never quite left the place no matter how many times we scrubbed the floors. Outside, through the window, the parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars under the flickering streetlights. I wiped my hands on my apron and glanced at the clock. 2 more hours until I could drive home and crawl into my own bed, away from the hum of fluorescent lights and the constant chatter of strangers. The diner was in a quiet neighborhood, not far from the main road, but far enough that the streets were mostly empty by this hour. I heard footsteps outside the door, a slow shuffle, hardly noticeable over the hum of the fridge. When I looked up, a man stood just beyond the glass. He wasn't a regular, that much I could tell. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring his face in shadow. I could only see the outline of his jaw and the little glint of his eyes catching the light. He didn't try to open the door or anything, just stood there, looking in, motionless. The kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was probably just someone waiting for a ride or trying to see if we were closed yet. I didn't want to make a scene. Sometimes people passed by late at night and stared in for a moment. After a minute, he moved away, walking down the sidewalk with slow, deliberate steps that disappeared into the darkness. I breathed out, telling myself it was nothing. But the unease stuck with me like a shadow. I finished cleaning the last dishes and wiped down the counters, my eyes flicking to the entrance every few seconds. When I finally locked the front door, I double-checked that it was secure. The metal bolt slid home solidly. Outside was silent again, empty except for the streetlights that buzzed overhead. No sign of the hoodie man. I grabbed my coat and purse, my hands trembling slightly even though I tried to keep calm. On my way to the car, I kept my head down, quickening my pace. The parking lot felt too wide, too bare in the cold night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked sharply, breaking the stillness. I locked myself inside the car, fumbling with the keys, and breathed deep. The drive home was slow and tense. The roads were empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stuck to the main streets, keeping the headlights on high beam. Every shadow seemed to shift just beyond the reach of the light. Twice, I caught glimpses of a car behind me, far enough back to make it hard to tell if it was following or just coincidental. When I stopped at a red light near the edge of town, the car behind me slowed but didn't stop. It stayed there, engine idling, the headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I glanced over my shoulder, heart pounding. The driver was a man, middle-aged, with a worn cap pulled low. His face was hard to read, expression unreadable in the dim light. At the green light, the man didn't speed up, just stayed behind me, matching my pace like he was waiting for something. I forced myself to stay calm, kept driving to the next intersection, then turned right onto a side street. The car hesitated but followed. I wanted to pull over, call someone, but the side street was narrow and dark, with no houses for a stretch. I kept going, trying to figure out where I could run, or at least see other people. The man's car stayed behind me, close enough to be threatening. When I finally reached my apartment building, I slowed down and pulled into the lot. The driver stayed behind me until I parked, then paused for a few seconds before turning around and driving off. I sat in my car, hands clenched tight on the steering wheel. My breath steamed up the windshield as I tried to steady my racing heart. Inside the apartment, I locked the door twice and jammed a chair against it. My phone screen lit up with missed calls from my sister and a few texts, but I didn't want to answer. I needed to think, to breathe. But the sense of being watched didn't go away. I caught myself glancing out the peephole every few minutes, waiting for shadows to move. Later, when I thought maybe I could relax, a soft tapping came at the window. I froze, staring at the glass. The tapping came again, 3 quick knocks, deliberate and sharp. My window faced the back alley, where no one should be. I pulled the curtains closed fast, heart thudding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just a branch or some random noise, but the timing was too precise, too intentional. I lay in bed, listening for any sign of movement outside, the air thick with dread. My phone was on the nightstand, screen cracked but working. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? That someone might be lurking outside, watching me? Without proof, they'd probably think I was overreacting. Sleep didn't come. Every small noise, creaking pipes, distant footsteps, the hum of the city felt like a threat. I kept the lamp on, the curtains drawn tight. My mind kept replaying the hoodie man at the diner, the car on the road, the tapping at the window. It was like the night had pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. By dawn, I'd convinced myself to stay put, to avoid going anywhere alone for a while. But even as the first light crept through the blinds, the feeling didn't lift. If anything, it grew sharper. Whoever was out there wasn't done with me yet. I didn't know what they wanted. And that was the worst part. The evening was fading fast by the time I left the office. It was one of those late March days where the sun hangs low and the chill clings stubbornly to the air, like winter just won't let go. The streets were humming with the usual after-work crowd, someone locking their bike to a lamppost, a couple arguing quietly near the bus stop, the distant rattling of a tram, but something about the way the shadows stretched along the buildings felt off. I glanced at my phone to check the time, 7:17 p.m. I'd promised myself I'd be home by 8, but the thought of going anywhere crowded tonight made me hesitate. I took a left instead of straight, cutting into a quieter neighborhood. My apartment was just a few blocks that way, but I wanted to avoid the main avenue where the bars and late-night shops were still noisy. The air was cool but dry, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves from the few trees lining the narrow street. A few windows glowed with warm light. Behind them, life carried on unnoticed. I pulled my coat tighter and tucked my hands into the pockets. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement as I walked, careful to keep to the streetlight's pulls of light. About halfway down the block, I saw him. He was standing just past the corner, under a flickering street lamp that cast his face in broken shadows. I didn't recognize him. He looked to be in his late 30s, average build, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, and he wasn't moving much. Just standing there, staring down the street the way I was headed. I slowed, trying to decide what to do. Maybe he was waiting for someone? The fact that he hadn't shifted his gaze or stepped forward made me uneasy. I thought about crossing the street, but the other side was darker, with fewer lights and no one else on foot. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw it was a message from my brother, asking if I wanted to grab coffee tomorrow morning. I typed a quick yes and pocketed the phone. The man was still there. I started walking again, a little faster this time. When I glanced back, he had moved closer to the lamp post, but not toward me, just a few steps to my left. The shadows caught his face again, and for a moment, I thought I saw him smile. But it didn't reach his eyes. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. My hands went clammy. Just as I was about to cross the street, he took a step forward. I stopped. He stopped. The space between us was maybe 10 feet. I considered turning around, but that would mean backtracking several blocks, and the street behind me was even darker. I tucked my phone back into my pocket and forced myself to keep walking. "Hey," I said, voice sharper than I intended. The man didn't answer. He just kept walking, parallel to me, matching my pace. I glanced sideways. He was still watching me, but his expression was unreadable. I picked up my pace, breaking into a light jog. He did the same. Panic bloomed in my chest. My mind raced. What if he was harmless and just heading the same way? But the way he stayed exactly with me, never passing or falling behind, felt deliberate. I reached the intersection where I needed to turn left to get to my building. Without thinking, I darted across the street, heart hammering. I heard his footsteps behind me, close and quick. I risked a glance. He was still there, but now he was jogging. I dove into the shadow of a parked van and pressed myself against the cold metal. My breath came shallow and fast. The streetlight above me flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw his face peek around the corner, but the light went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. I counted to 30, trying to calm down. When I finally risked peeking out, the street was empty. No signs of him. I exhaled slowly and pushed myself away from the van. Maybe it was a coincidence, but my instinct screamed otherwise. I pulled my phone out and dialed my brother. The line rang, and my voice trembled a little as I asked him to come get me from the building. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. I didn't want to wait outside. I moved quickly down the street, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The glow from my apartment window looked like a small island of safety. I fumbled with my keys, hands still shaking, and finally got the door open. Inside, I locked the deadbolt in the chain, then slid the bolt on the sliding glass door to the balcony. I closed the curtains tight and sat on the couch, phone in hand, waiting. The dim light from the kitchen clock ticked away the minutes. Every creak in the apartment sounded amplified. I tried to remind myself that I was safe here, but the image of that man, standing in the dark under the flickering street lamp, matched with the steady rhythm of footsteps following me, refused to leave my mind. When my brother's knock finally came, relief washed over me. I opened the door quickly and pulled him inside, closing it behind us. "Who was that?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I said, voice barely above a whisper. But he was following me. He looked toward the window. "You want me to stay the night?" I nodded. "Yeah. I don't think I want to be alone right now." As he settled in, I kept thinking about the man's eyes. There was something about them, empty but focused, that made me feel like this was only the beginning. I had never planned to stay out late on a Tuesday, but my shift at the diner had run longer than usual, clogged by a slow drip of regulars and a thin trickle of new faces who seemed more interested in the cheap coffee than the food. When I finally locked up, the street was empty except for a few scattered cars and the shaky glow of distant streetlights. The night air was cool, but not cold early spring, the kind of weather that made you think you might not need a jacket, only to regret it 5 minutes later. I glanced at my phone. midnight. My car was parked 2 blocks away, across the old gas station that still had its pump but no attendant. The uneven pavement was slick from a light rain that had stopped an hour ago, the only sound the soft patter of my shoes against the concrete and my breath, shallow and uneven. I wanted to get inside my car and lock the doors before I got too deep into the night. As I walked past the closed gas station, I noticed something odd. There was a man standing in the shadowed corner beside the building. He was tall, his face partially obscured by the low brim of a baseball cap, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark jacket. I didn't hear him breathe or shuffle. He just stood there, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something or someone. I slowed down, heart ticking up a notch, and avoided eye contact as I hurried past. The streetlights above flickered, and for a moment, the man was nearly swallowed by darkness. When the light steadied again, he was still there. I kept my pace steady and told myself it was nothing, maybe someone homeless or a late-night smoker, just waiting for a ride or a friend. But then I heard the footsteps behind me. Slow at first, but deliberate. I didn't want to look back, but the sound was too close now, matching my pace, only a few feet behind. My stomach tightened, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me like it was armor. I could hear the faint scrape of a sneaker catching on gravel, then the steady crunch against broken glass scattered near the gas station's foundation. I dared to glance backward. The man from the corner had started following me. His face was still mostly hidden, but now I could see the outline of his jaw, the way his shoulders hunched slightly forward. There was no one else on the street. No other noises except that slow, steady pace behind me. I stopped walking and turned sharply, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you following me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, hands still in pockets, and I could see his eyes now, dark and fixed on me. There was no recognition there, no flicker of any kind of emotion, just focused attention. I swallowed hard. "Look, I don't want any trouble." He didn't say a word. The silence between us stretched, growing thick and suffocating. A cold wind blew down the street, rattling loose plastic bags and sending a shiver through me. I looked down the block. My car was still there, but it suddenly felt miles away. I took another step back, then another, until I was pressed against the rough brick wall of an empty storefront. The man mirrored me, closing the distance until I could smell the faint odor of cigarette smoke and something else, maybe sweat or old leather. "Why are you following me?" I asked again, voice barely above a whisper. His mouth twitched, almost like a smirk, but then he just laughed. It was low, breathy, and unexpected. He took a step even closer, and I felt the weight of his presence like a living thing pressing against me. "I was wondering when you'd notice," he said. My mind scrambled, trying to think of what to say next, but fear pinched my throat. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, loud enough to drown out the distant hum of a train rolling somewhere far off. "Look, I don't know who you are," I said, "but leave me alone." He tilted his head, amusement flashing briefly in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere." My heart slammed again and I realized I was running out of options. There was no one else on the street, no one to call out to. My phone was in my jacket pocket, but I was too afraid to pull it out. What if he grabbed me? What if I gave myself away? The man took another step forward, closing the gap between us entirely. His voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "You have a nice habit of looking over your shoulder," he said. "But it's a good thing you did." I pressed my back further against the wall, trying to imagine a way out that didn't involve giving in to panic. Then, just as I was about to scream or bolt, headlights appeared at the far end of the street, bright and sudden. A car was coming, slow but steady, its engine humming like a promise. The man swore under his breath and hesitated. The light caught his face again, shadow and hard angles, and then he took a step back, melting once more into the dark corner beside the gas station. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I sprinted the last 2 blocks to my car, fumbling with the keys while my hands shook. The man's movements were still burned into my mind, slow, deliberate, patient. I locked every door and slid into the driver's seat, heart thudding so hard I was sure I would crack ribs. I kept the engine running and the headlights on, staring nervously at the gas station until the car behind me turned the corner and disappeared down the street. Only then, when I felt a thread of safety returning, did I finally exhale. But as I drove home, the man's parting words echoed in my mind, "It's a good thing you noticed." Someone had been following me long before I realized it. And that thought made the night feel colder than it already was. That afternoon started like any other Friday. I clocked out at 5, grabbed my backpack, and headed for the bus stop a few blocks from the office. The sky was a dull gray, and a light drizzle was just beginning to mist the streets. I pulled my jacket collar up against the chill and waited, glancing at my phone to distract myself. The bus was supposed to arrive in 10 minutes, but at least it kept me near familiar faces and the buzz of the city. I noticed a man standing a little ways down the street, under the awning of a closed storefront. He was tall, mid-30s, wearing a worn leather jacket that looked heavy for the damp weather. His hair was dark, slicked back, and he smoked a cigarette, flicking ashes onto the pavement. I didn't think much of him, just another person passing time. But the way he watched me made me uneasy. His eyes kept flicking toward me and back to the street like he was waiting for something or someone. The bus rolled up 8 minutes late, its headlights cutting through the mist. As I stepped forward, the man exhaled a plume of smoke and casually shifted toward the corner, disappearing from sight. I climbed aboard, chose a seat by the window, and sunk into it, grateful to be out of the cold. The ride was typical, noisy, cramped, the faint smell of wet coats and fast food lingering in the air. But when we pulled off the main avenue onto a quieter residential road, I saw the same man again. He was standing beside a silver SUV parked halfway in the street, staring directly at the bus. There was something off in the way he held himself, like he was waiting for me specifically. I tried to shake it off, maybe he was just headed home or walking a dog I hadn't seen. Still, I felt a prickle crawling up my spine. I tucked my phone deeper into my jacket pocket and kept looking out the window, trying not to meet his gaze again. At my stop, I stepped off quickly. The rain was picking up, heavier now, drumming a steady rhythm on the umbrella I'd hurried to open. I hurried down the block toward my apartment building, the familiar route feeling strangely unfamiliar. I glanced behind me once, then twice. The street was empty except for the occasional figure rushing somewhere else. No sign of a man. The door to my building was locked, but I had my key in hand and fumbled to unlock it. Just as I pushed the door open and slipped inside, I heard footsteps behind me. Not hurried, but deliberate. Slow. I turned my head slightly and caught a glimpse of him, the same man from before, with his cigarette unlit now, hands jammed deep in his pockets. The hallway smelled faintly of damp carpet and bleach. I kept my pace steady, not breaking stride, but my heart was thumping. I could feel his presence behind me, and that made every noise sharper, the scrape of my boots on tile, the soft thud of his footsteps hitting the floor. I reached my apartment door, swiped the key, and twisted the handle. It caught for a moment, then opened. I slipped inside, closing and locking it quickly behind me. My chest heaved with a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I pressed my back against the door and listened. The hallway was silent. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. I kept the chain latch on and edged toward the window to peer out. The street was empty, rain washing the footprints away. I thought maybe I had imagined the man following me, or maybe he had just been waiting for someone else. But my skin still crawled. That night, I left the curtains slightly open. I felt safer watching the street, even if it was just so I could tell if anyone was out there. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of a car door slamming somewhere outside. I sat up, heart beating fast in the dark. The rain had stopped, but the street lamp across the road flickered weakly, casting long shadows that looked like hands reaching out. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to look, but I did. Behind the window, I saw a figure standing just beyond the pool of light. Tall, hunched slightly under a hooded jacket. The cigarette glow was gone. It was the man again. He didn't move for what felt like minutes. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the side street. I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about what he wanted, if he'd come back, if he'd been watching me all along. The next day, I avoided the usual bus stop and took a longer route to work. I kept my phone in hand, pretending to text, but really watching the people around me. No sign of a man. Still, the feeling didn't leave. That night, I installed a cheap doorbell camera. It wasn't much, but I told myself it was better than nothing. Days passed. No sign of a man. But then, one evening, I was coming home around 9 p.m., walking the last block with groceries in my arms, when I noticed a figure sitting on the stoop across the street. Head down, hood pulled low. I didn't recognize him immediately, but something made my blood run cold. It was the man. He didn't look up, just stayed seated on the cold stone steps, as if waiting for me. I crossed the street abruptly, hoping the sudden movement would spook him, but he stayed. I quickened my pace, keys ready in my hand, and made it inside without looking back. That night, I checked the footage from the doorbell camera. Around 8:50 p.m., the camera caught a blurry figure standing outside, just out of the frame of the porch light. The video was grainy, but the shape and posture were unmistakable. The police told me to stay alert, report anything suspicious, and consider changing my locks. They said they'd increase patrols in the area, but admitted these things often came down to luck and vigilance. I started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed. Every noise in the building made me jump. Every creak in the floor sounded like footsteps. One evening, as I was locking up after a late shift, I noticed a scratch on my doorframe, fresh, deep enough to catch at my nail. My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed it before. I called the police again. They took a report but said there was not much they could do unless they caught someone in the act. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the window, bat in hand, watching the street, waiting for something I hoped wouldn't come. The man's presence was no longer a distant threat. It was close, tangible, like a shadow that stretched into my home. But for now, he had retreated. At least, that's what I told myself. I didn't know if I could hold out much longer. But I had no choice. The man was waiting somewhere out there, and I was running out of places to hide. Story 3, Silent Pines, The Unseen Presence. The night shift at the convenience store was always slow, but I liked it that way. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only thing breaking the silence, and the occasional beep of the register was a comfort. It meant anyone had come through the door, if only to buy a pack of gum or a soda. I wasn't expecting much that Thursday night, not after the steady early evening rush had trickled to a steady nothing. I was stacking shelves behind the counter when the bell over the door chimed softly. I looked up and saw a man, tall, maybe in his late 30s, with a thin face and eyes that didn't quite meet mine. He wore a dark jacket that looked heavy for spring and had a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Nothing about him screamed danger, but there was a twitch in his jaw, a tension I couldn't shake. He walked slowly down the aisles, fingers trailing over the tops of cans and boxes as if he was measuring something invisible. I watched from behind the counter, trying to focus on the magazines I'd been pretending to read, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. He paused at the back of the store, under the flickering emergency exit sign, and stared at the rows of frozen dinners. After a long moment, he picked one up, some cheap lasagna, and tossed it onto the floor. The clatter echoed oddly in the quiet space. I glanced around, but the other aisles were empty. The man didn't look at me, didn't seem to notice. He just stood there, breathing a little hard, as if the act of dropping that box had been deliberate. I cleared my throat. "Can I help you find something?" He turned his head slowly, eyes finally meeting mine, and for a second, I thought he might say something reasonable. Instead, he just shook his head and moved toward the checkout counter. My stomach nodded. He didn't pull out a wallet or a phone, he just stood there, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "Sir?" I said, voice a little higher than I meant. He didn't answer. Then, without warning, he pulled out a small object from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, maybe an inch square, and slid it across the counter toward me. I picked it up cautiously, unfolding the paper. It was a crude drawing of the store's layout, with the back door circled in red ink. A single word was scrawled underneath: soon. The fluorescent light flickered again, and the store suddenly felt colder, the air thick and heavy. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "If you're looking for something specific, I can help." He just grunted, turned on his heel, and walked out the door without another word. The bell chimed behind him, and the night swallowed the sound. I stood frozen for a moment, the paper still in my hand. My heart hammered. Was this some kind of joke? A prank? It didn't feel like one. I looked around the empty store, every shadow suddenly sharp and dangerous. I debated calling the police, but worried they'd think I was overreacting. Instead, I stuffed the note into my pocket and locked the door behind me when the next customer came in about an hour later. The rest of the night passed in a blur of nervous glances toward the windows and an ever-growing sense of unease. By the time my shift ended, the parking lot was empty except for my car. I hurried to it, never looking back, and drove home faster than I should have, the note burning a hole in my jacket pocket the entire way. That night, I double-locked every door and window, checked the deadbolt twice, and slept with the lights on. But when I woke in the early hours, I could swear I heard footsteps outside my window. They stopped just beyond the porch light's reach, then retreated. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it wasn't over. I forced myself up the next morning, the note still clutched in my fist. It was simple, almost childish in its scrawl, but the message was clear: you can't hide forever. My breath came out ragged. I wanted to burn the thing, shred it into nothing, but some part of me, a darker, more stubborn part, kept it close like a warning or a challenge. I tried to push it aside as I moved through my day, but the sense of being watched was suffocating. At the grocery store, I caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping behind the aisles, but when I turned, there was nothing but empty shelves and blinking fluorescent lights. At work, every creak in the old building made my skin crawl, and my coworkers' casual glances seemed layered with silent questions I didn't want to answer. That night, I didn't bother with the lights. I pulled the curtains tight and sat by the window, staring into the blackness beyond. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the slow tick of the wall clock. Then, faintly, I heard it again, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. They moved along the edge of the porch, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the glow of the street lamp. My heart hammered in my chest. I gripped the note, tracing the jagged letters with my thumb. The footsteps circled the house now, coming closer to the back. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like an animal cornered in its own den. Suddenly, the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness, and the porch light flickered violently before dying completely. The footsteps stopped. An eerie silence filled the air, thick and suffocating. Then, a whisper. It wasn't a voice, not a word, just a breath, a sigh, a presence so close I could feel it pressing against the glass. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else, but the cold dread settling in my bones was undeniable. I reached for my phone, but the screen stayed black, no signal, no light. Panic surged through me as I realized I was utterly alone, trapped in a house that no longer felt safe. The whisper grew louder, turning into a low rasp, and then into a voice I thought I'd never hear again. My name, dragged out slowly, as if tasting the sound. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just waited, frozen, as the night swallowed me whole. The late afternoon sun was slipping behind the trees as I locked the door to the grocery store, the familiar creak of the old deadbolt oddly comforting. I was tired from the shift, the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the repetitive beep of the scanner still buzzing faintly in my ears. My hands smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. Outside, the parking lot was half empty, the spaces near the store mostly clear except for a battered pickup truck parked under a flickering street lamp. I grabbed my purse and phone from behind the counter and headed to my car, a silver sedan I had for 5 years. The engine ticked as it cooled, and when I climbed in, I could feel the cool leather seat against my skin. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of dry leaves blown by a cool wind scraping against the pavement. I was ready to get home, change, and call Sarah. We planned to meet for dinner, but I felt a strange reluctance that I couldn't shake. The idea of sitting in a crowded restaurant suddenly felt exhausting. I decided to drive home, shower, and maybe just order in. I pulled out of the lot and onto the main road, the streetlights flickering on in patches as the sky darkened. The road was empty, the headlights of my car cutting a narrow path through the gathering dusk. I tried to focus on the radio, but every song felt distant, drowned out by an unease I couldn't name. About 5 minutes into the drive, I noticed a black sedan behind me in the rearview mirror. No headlights, just dark glass reflecting the few streetlights. It was close, too close, and it stayed there even when I changed lanes. My heart rate picked up, a tight knot forming in my stomach. I tried slowing down, then speeding up. The car matched my pace every time. I pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent pump lights buzzing overhead. The black sedan stopped behind me, but the driver's seat was empty. I blinked, confused. Where had the driver gone? I looked around the lot, but there was no sign of anyone. The car just sat there, engine idling, windows tinted. I didn't want to look like I was watching the car, so I grabbed my purse and headed to the small convenience store inside. The air conditioning was a relief after the stifling car. I grabbed a bottle of water, trying to steady my breathing. When I turned around, the black sedan had pulled forward, closer to the exit, but still empty. I glanced at the attendant, a middle-aged man who was busy restocking shelves. I didn't know if I should ask him if he'd seen anyone suspicious, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I paid quickly and got back into my car, locking the doors the moment I sat down. The black sedan was gone. I exhaled shakily and pulled back onto the road, eyes scanning the rearview mirror obsessively. The streetlights cast long shadows over cracked pavement, trees lining both sides like silent sentinels. I tried to convince myself it had been a coincidence, maybe someone parked and left their car running. Still, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. About 10 minutes later, I turned down the narrow road that led to my neighborhood. The street was poorly lit, overgrown trees arching over the pavement, branches scraping softly against the windows. As I slowed, my headlights caught a figure standing on the sidewalk ahead, just beyond the pool of light from a lonely street lamp. A man, tall and gaunt, with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark jacket. I hesitated, heart thudding in my chest. The street was quiet except for the soft whisper of the wind. The man didn't move as I approached, didn't even glance up. I thought about stopping, but something in the way he stood, motionless and silent, froze me in place. I edged the car forward slowly, ready to speed off at the slightest sign of movement. The man finally looked up, and when our eyes met, I felt my breath catch. His expression was blank, unreadable, but the intensity of his stare made me want to look away. His mouth twitched briefly, like a half-smile, but never fully formed. I slammed the car into reverse and backed out of the street, the gravel crunching under my tires. I drove around the block and tried again, hoping the man would be gone, but he was still there, standing in the same spot, as if he'd been waiting for me. I swallowed hard, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The street lamp flickered, casting his shadow long and wavering on the pavement. Then, without moving, he raised a hand slowly and pointed directly at my car. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned sharply onto the main road and didn't look back. The house felt like a sanctuary when I finally pulled into the driveway. The porch light was on, and the faint glow from inside warmed the windows. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling, and slipped inside, locking the door behind me before I dared to breathe out. Inside, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I moved through the rooms quickly, turning on lights, checking locks, even peering out the windows, but the street was empty, no sign of a man, no black sedan. Just the quiet creaks of the house settling in, distant sounds of the neighborhood winding down. I sat down on the couch, the fabric rough against my palms. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it real? Had I imagined the whole thing? But the cold sweat on my neck and the tight ache in my chest told me otherwise. I called Sarah, voice shaky, and told her I wasn't up for dinner. She understood, and we agreed I'd come by tomorrow instead. Hanging up, I kept checking the windows, the curtains pulled tight, the blinds drawn. Hours later, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard it, the faintest creak from the back door. A sound so soft I thought maybe it was the house again. My breath caught, and I froze, straining to listen. The creak came again, followed by a soft scrape, like a finger dragging across wood. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding so loudly it filled the room. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the back porch. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, nothing but silence. Then, a soft tapping on the glass. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, lights on, phone in hand, waiting for dawn as the shadow outside pressed against the window, watching, waiting. The bus shuddered along the cracked pavement, groaning under the weight of slow traffic and late afternoon heat. I sat near the back, the window beside me fogged with the residue of breath and sweat, blurring the trees and storefronts into a lazy watercolor. My phone was dead, as it had been for the last hour, and the whole day was folding into itself like a crumpled receipt. I'd missed my usual train because I'd lingered too long at the library, trying to finish that report for work. The bus route wasn't direct, and now I was trapped in this crawl from the outskirts of town toward the center, with no signal, no charger, and a growing sense of unease I couldn't shake. Outside, the streetlights were flickering to life as dusk clawed its way into the sky. The bus wasn't crowded, maybe 15 people scattered in pairs or alone, all staring down at their laps or out the windows. A few wore headphones, others scrolled on phones, but I noticed one man near the front who kept looking back at me. He was middle-aged, in a rumpled jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, his eyes catching mine long enough to make me flinch. There was no reason for it, he didn't smile or say anything, but the intent in his gaze felt deliberate. I shifted in my seat, trying to focus on the cracked screen of my dead phone, willing it to come back to life. The bus slowed again, and I watched the man stand up, clutching the pole with a knuckled grip as he took slow steps backward, inching closer to the rear. My heart ratcheted up a notch. He was heading my way. I looked away, feigning interest in the peeling posters advertising community theater and lost pets. When I glanced back, a few rows ahead, he'd stopped, crouched to pick something off the floor. I could see him better now, his fingers were trembling. There was something off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. A nervous twitch. Or something darker. The bus lurched forward again. I could feel the vibrations through the thin seat, the muffled hum of the engine under the low chatter of passengers. I unzipped my backpack, fingers fumbling for the small pocket with the pepper spray I kept after the incident last year. My hands were slick with sweat, and it almost slipped before I caught it. Then the man stood up again and moved toward the back door, pressing his hand against the window as if to peer outside. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like the bus was shrinking around me, the walls closing in. I considered standing, moving toward the driver, but the bus was crowded enough that I'd have to pass too close, too openly. Instead, I shrank lower in my seat, eyes flicking to the door. The man hadn't noticed me this time. His gaze was fixed outside, dark and unblinking. The street was empty, the sidewalk cracked and littered with cigarette butts and small scraps of paper fluttering in the breeze. A sharp scrape on the floor behind me made me jump. Without turning, I reached back, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the emergency hammer mounted near the window. I gripped it tightly, knuckles white, as if just holding it could somehow make me safer. The bus stopped again, this time at a station I recognized, the last stop before the city center. A few people got off and others got on. The man stayed seated, but his eyes never left me. I could feel them burning, a steady, chilling presence that made me want to bolt. When the doors hissed closed and the bus pulled away, I noticed the man's cap had shifted slightly, revealing a patch of greasy hair matted against his scalp. His mouth was set in a hard line, lips pressed together as if holding back words or teeth. I thought about the stories I'd heard: random attacks on buses, people followed home, strangers with no clear motive. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it felt like a warning. I debated trying to switch seats, but every glance around showed faces I didn't recognize, some too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the quiet tension between me and this man. The bus rolled on, the hum of the engine steady, punctuated by the occasional cough or rustle of a plastic bag. I tried to keep my breathing even, but the taste of copper filled my mouth, dry and bitter. My throat tightened, and I realized I was gripping my pepper spray so hard the spray nozzle was pressed against my palm. Minutes dragged. The bus took a sharp turn, its tires squealing faintly against the asphalt. We passed a dimly lit alleyway, shadows pooling beneath the flicker of a broken street lamp. The man stood up again abruptly, moving toward the back door with a slow, deliberate pace. Every second stretched thin, every noise amplified: the rattle of the bus's air conditioning, the faint murmur of the radio trapped in the driver's cab, the soft thump of someone's backpack hitting the floor. I held my breath, heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear. Then, as suddenly as he had moved, the man stopped halfway, turning his head sharply as if hearing something behind him. His eyes flickered past me, out the window. The tension in his posture cracked just slightly, like a fault line shifting beneath concrete. I exhaled slowly, not daring to smile or relax. The bus was nearing my stop, a place I knew well but never thought twice about before this ride. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, the pepper spray nestled in my palm like a lifeline. When the bus slowed and the doors hissed open, the evening air hit me with the sharp scent of rain and exhaust. I stood quickly, stepping off into the fading light, the man still seated, staring after me with a look I couldn't read. I walked briskly down the street toward my apartment, the sidewalks quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. The streetlights cast long shadows that twisted oddly in the dimming day. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, rhythmic, matching my pace, but every time I glanced back, there was only empty sidewalk and the occasional flicker of a passing car. I told myself I was imagining it, that the tension had just frayed my nerves. But when I reached the corner and turned toward home, I caught sight of a figure standing beneath a street lamp across the intersection, a man in a jacket and baseball cap, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching. I swallowed hard and kept walking, faster now, heart pounding, hoping the streetlights would stretch their reach just enough to keep me safe. The streetlights flickered as I walked down Maple Avenue, the late November cold biting through my thin jacket. I had missed the last bus, and the idea of waiting alone at the empty stop several blocks away wasn't appealing. So I decided to walk home instead. It was only about a mile, but with the day already swallowed by night, everything felt smaller, more cramped, like the darkness was pressing in on me. I kept my hands in my pockets, trying to ignore the crunch of leaves underfoot. The houses were mostly dark, curtains drawn tight, though a few windows cast pale glows on the sidewalks. The night smelled damp, like wet earth and rotting leaves, the kind of smell you usually only notice when the world is quiet enough to notice anything at all. At the corner, where Oak Street intersected, I noticed a man standing just off the sidewalk under the buzz of a failing street lamp. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood up, his face mostly shadowed. I didn't recognize him. I paused for a moment, heart ticking faster than usual. He shifted his weight but didn't move toward me. I glanced at my phone, the screen cracked in the corner but still functional. No signal. I took a step forward. He moved. Not toward me exactly, but out of the street lamp's weak glow, stepping into the deeper shadows of the empty lot beside the closed hardware store. The chill in the air seemed to deepen, and my breath came out in short puffs. I kept walking, though my pace quickened. My eyes darted to the windows of the aisles as I passed, half expecting to see someone watching. None did. By the time I reached the old park at the next corner, the silence felt unnatural. The swing set, rusty and creaking in the cold wind, looked like a trap. I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. I stopped, heart pounding again. The footsteps stopped too. I looked over my shoulder. No one. I waited a few seconds, then started walking again, this time faster. The empty park stretched on my left, a narrow path cutting through thick trees that swallowed what little light there was. It was the shortcut I sometimes took, but tonight the shadows seemed too deep. I could feel movement in the brush, small noises that didn't belong. Halfway through, a figure stepped onto the path ahead of me, blocking the way. It was the man from before. This time I could see his face, pale and sharp, eyes dark and unreadable beneath the hood. He said nothing. Just stood there. Quiet, still, like a statue. I swallowed and tried to step around him, but he shifted to block me again. "Excuse me," I said, my voice uneven. "I need to get through." He didn't answer. His eyes flicked to my hand, where I was holding my phone like a lifeline. I clenched my fists, trying to keep calm. My mind raced through every possible outcome, every possible response. I tried to remember the bus schedule again, how far I was from the next stop, how many houses were still occupied nearby, how fast I could sprint. He moved closer, the smell of stale sweat mixed with something else, something sharp and sour. "Hey," I said louder, stepping back. "Please, just let me pass." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately. Panic surged through me like ice water. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, twigs cracked underfoot, the path twisting and uneven. I heard him behind me, footsteps pounding fast, but not running, steady, relentless. I didn't look back. When I burst out of the trees on the other side, I was on a quiet residential street, the houses close together, windows dark and lifeless. I sprinted toward the nearest porch light, shouting for help, but no one answered. The silence was complete. I ran to the next corner and stopped, chest heaving, hands trembling. The man was nowhere in sight. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it, or maybe he'd just been another stranger loitering. But the pounding in my chest said otherwise. I checked my phone again, still no signal. In the distance, a dog barked once, shattering the quiet. I kept moving, my pace slow but purposeful, moving toward my apartment. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checked every window, and collapsed on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. The man was still out there somewhere, and I had no idea why he'd been following me, why he'd blocked my path. I thought about calling someone, but without signal, it wasn't an option. I sat there, the silence thick, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that I wasn't alone. The room felt colder now, shadows stretching longer than they should. My eyes darted to the window. The streetlight flickered, casting uneven light that made the curtains twitch. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. Every creak in the building, every distant thud, tightened the knot in my stomach. I tried to focus on breathing, slow and steady, but the silence screamed louder than any noise. Then, I heard a faint scratching, coming from the back door. My pulse hammered in my ears as I forced myself to stand, moving cautiously toward the sound. The scratches stopped. I froze. "Who's there?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. No answer. Just the cold, unyielding quiet. The night had fallen thick and early, the kind of dark that swallowed every trace of the fading twilight as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. I was driving home after another late shift at the hospital, the radio playing quietly but mostly drowned out by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the static. The freeway was mostly empty, save for the occasional truck lumbering past, its headlights briefly blinding me before vanishing into the distance. I had taken this route home countless times, the narrow stretch of road cutting through thin woods on either side. It was a shortcut, sure, but also a little unsettling at night. Trees that crowded close, their branches scraping the sides of the car if the wind was strong enough. Tonight, the air was still, almost suffocatingly so. The silence outside pressed against my skin. About 10 miles in, I noticed a car behind me, headlights steady and bright in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it. People drove late on occasion. But after a few minutes, it didn't pass me. Instead, it stayed there, at the same distance, matching my speed exactly. I glanced over my shoulder. Dark sedan, no visible markings, the driver's face obscured by shadows and the glass's reflection. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and accelerated slightly. The car responded in kind, inching closer as I pushed the gas. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was paranoia. Maybe the driver was lost, or just heading the same way. The road curved sharply ahead, and I flicked on my right blinker to take the exit ramp toward my neighborhood. The car followed, brakes tapping lightly as it mirrored my movements. My throat tightened. I debated speeding up, but the exit ramp was narrow, with patches shimmering faintly under the streetlights, and I didn't want to lose control. Once off the main road, the streetlights thinned out, replaced by the dim glow of porch lamps and the occasional flicker of a television through half-closed curtains. The sedan stayed behind me, slower now, but trailing just close enough to be purposeful. I pulled into my driveway, heart pounding so loud I was sure the driver could hear it through their car. The sedan stopped a few houses down, engine idling silently. My hands trembled as I locked the doors and dashed inside, the familiar click of the deadbolt a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there. The house was still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's television. I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. But then, faintly, I heard it, footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crossing the patch of grass toward my front door. I swallowed hard, the cold crawl of fear tracing the line of my spine. The footsteps stopped. There was silence. Then a soft, almost casual tapping at the glass of the front window. I didn't move. My mind raced for any logical explanation, but none came. A neighbor? A mistaken house? The tapping persisted, rhythmic and patient, like a code I couldn't decipher. I crept to the kitchen, where I kept the largest knives, gripping the handle of a carving knife as tightly as I could without shaking. My phone was on the counter, screen dark. I flicked it on, fingers clumsy, and dialed 911, whispering my address into the line. The tapping stopped. Seconds dragged on. The quiet was louder than before. Then, the faint crunch of gravel as the sedan's engine started, headlights flicked off, and it rolled away slowly, back down the street and into the shadows. I stayed on the call with the operator, describing what I'd seen and heard until the patrol car arrived. When the officer knocked on my door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, I felt a flicker of relief, however small. But as he walked the perimeter and radioed in, his expression didn't change. He warned me to keep all doors locked, to be vigilant, and that vehicles matching the description had been seen casing houses in the neighborhood over the past week. As he left, the night felt heavier, the shadows longer. I locked every window again, double-checked the doors, and sat on the floor with the knife still in my hand, the phone clutched against my chest. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere, a car door slammed shut. The slam echoed sharply, a sudden punctuation in the suffocating quiet. I froze, breath shallow, ears straining for the faintest hint of movement. The street lamp flickered above, casting a rhythmic strobe of pale light across the yard. Then, footsteps, soft, deliberate, circled the house's perimeter. My fingers tightened around the knife's cold handle. I wanted to call the sheriff back, but the radio was dead silent, no response. A cold sweat trickled down my spine as the footsteps halted right outside the window beside me. Heart hammering, I pressed my back against the wall, willing myself invisible. The shadow lingered, elongated, then receded. Minutes, or was it hours, passed. When I finally mustered the courage to peek through the curtains, the street was empty, the car gone. But the unease remained, thick and unrelenting, as if something had been left behind, watching, waiting. Story 4, Mind's Mirage, the Unseen Puppet Master. I was finishing up the last of my packing in the dim light of the motel room when I realized something felt off. It wasn't the usual discomfort that came with being away from home or the cramped quarters of the place. It was a subtle, nagging sensation that made my skin crawl, like the room was holding its breath, watching me. I had arrived in this town just a few hours ago, a nameless blur on the interstate, a place I thought would be quiet enough to spend the weekend working on a freelance project. The motel was one of those roadside joints, peeling paint, flickering neon sign out front that buzzed faintly against the night sky, but it was cheap and close to the highway. Perfect, I figured, for a short stay. The front desk clerk was polite in the way that people are when they don't want you asking questions. I had noticed the way his eyes lingered longer than necessary when I handed over my driver's license, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. I brushed it off as tiredness on both our parts, mine from the long drive, his from the late shift. Now, sitting on the bed with my laptop bag and notebook scattered around me, I heard the muffled thump of something against the wall outside. I paused, listening, but it stopped. Maybe a loose shutter in the wind. I told myself that. The air was stale and thick with the smell of mildew and cigarette smoke, and the window was cracked just enough to let in the sharp coolness of the night. As I sipped up my bag, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. A shadow passed quickly across the yellow curtain, too quick to be a bird or small animal. It stopped me cold. I strained to see through the thin fabric, eyes adjusting to the street lamp's dull glow. A man, I could tell by the outline, was standing just beyond the parking lot, near the edge of the gravel road that led to the back of the property. He was too far to make out much, but he seemed to be watching the motel, or maybe just the building I was in. My heart ticked up, and I swallowed hard. People don't stand around outside these places this late without a reason. I considered calling the front desk but doubted they'd do much. Instead, I pulled the curtain closed and locked the window tightly. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. I double-checked the deadbolt on the door, the cold metal familiar and reassuring between my fingers. The hallway beyond was quiet, the faint hum of a television drifting through the thin walls. I tried the knob again, it held firm. Deciding to distract myself, I turned on the TV, hoping the static noise would drown out the tension building in my chest. The screen flickered to life, offering grainy local news and a weather forecast that promised rain. The image was fuzzy, the sound crackling, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. They stopped, then shifted, light brushing against the wood like someone was leaning against it. I froze, every muscle taut. The footsteps retreated, moving down the hall, then silence. I don't know why I didn't call the police then. Maybe it was disbelief, that sinking feeling that no one would believe me or that it was all in my head. Instead, I sat on the bed, clutching my phone, debating whether to text my sister. She'd tell me to leave, to get out of there, but I had no car. I'd left it at the gas station a few blocks back, and I didn't want to make a scene. Minutes dragged by. My breathing was loud in the quiet room. Then, through the thin motel walls, I heard the scrape of a chair being moved, like someone was shifting furniture. I tried to tell myself it was another guest, but none of the rooms near mine had been rented that night. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't be here." The words felt like ice sliding down my spine. I checked my pockets, but I hadn't given out my number anywhere. The message was too sharp, too personal to ignore. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but I kept it steady, hands trembling. I texted back, fingers fumbling. "Who's this?" No reply. I looked through the peephole in the door, nothing but the dim hallway and a flickering bulb. Then I moved to the window and peeked out again. No one. The shadow was gone. Maybe I'd imagined it. But then, a soft tapping began at the window, slow and rhythmic. I ducked out of sight. The taps came again, steady, like someone's fingernails tracing the glass. I swallowed hard, eyes locked on the window. The nearby street lamp buzzed and flickered, casting the room into an uneven strobe. When the light returned, I saw a face pressed briefly against the glass, a man, pale and gaunt, with eyes too wide open. He was gone before I could blink. My breath caught, and the phone buzzed again. Another message, this one even colder. "Don't open." I sank to the floor, heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst through my ribs. The room was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and something outside was trying to get in. I stayed on the floor, ears straining for any sound. The minutes that followed felt endless. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and the hallway fell silent again. I didn't move until dawn, and even then, I was too afraid to leave the room. When the morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, I peeked outside the door. No one around. No sign of the man or the messages. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. But as I gathered my things to check out, I noticed something strange on the floor near the window, a single cigarette butt, fresh and still warm. I hadn't smoked in years. The clock on the dashboard glowed 11:14 p.m. as I pulled off Highway 35 and onto the narrow gravel road that led to my parents' cabin. A cold wind rattled the car's windows, carrying the faint sharp scent of pine and something else, smoke, maybe. I'd been driving for hours, and the dark woods on either side of the road pressed in close, shadows thick beneath the streetlights that were few and far between. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, and the headlights barely reached past the first row of trees. I'd left the city behind hours ago after work, hoping to find some peace with the quiet night and the familiar silence of the cabin. My parents were away for the weekend, and the place was mine alone. I'd called ahead to let them know I'd be there by midnight, but I'd gotten a little lost, and the delay made me anxious in a way I couldn't shake. When I finally spotted the cabin's porch light flickering on the left side of the road, I felt a brief flicker of relief. But as I edged the car closer, the light went out. I blinked, staring into the darkness. The whole place was suddenly swallowed up in silence except for the faint rustling of branches. I pulled the car past the driveway and onto the grass, the tires sinking slightly into the damp earth. The cabin looked empty, like it always did when no one was home, windows dark and curtains drawn tight. But something about the silence felt heavier, thicker. I stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin, The gravel crunched under my boots as I moved toward the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and I reached for the door handle. It was locked, just like always. I fumbled in my jacket pocket for the key I'd been given and slid it into the lock. The key turned with a soft click, and I pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, smelling faintly of wood smoke and dust. I set my bag down by the door and flipped the light switch. The single bulb overhead buzzed and flickered but gave off enough light to reveal the empty living room, the couch sagging slightly, the coffee table cleared save for some magazines. I moved toward the kitchen to grab some water. The silence was overwhelming, like the house was holding its breath. I reached for the tap and turned it on, the water sputtering before flowing steadily. I heard a faint noise then, something metallic, a quick tapping coming from the back of the cabin. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Another tap, soft but deliberate. I set the glass down slowly and crept toward the back door. The kitchen's single window looked out onto the dense forest behind the house. Through the glass, a shadow shifted just beyond the edge of the porch light's reach. I blinked and the shadow was gone, swallowed by the night. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other woodland creature, but the sound had been too rhythmic to be random. I swallowed hard and backed away from the window, my heart beating louder and louder in my ears. "Hello?" I called out, voice cracking. "Is someone there?" Silence. Only the distant whisper of wine through the trees. I forced myself to shake it off and headed to the bedroom at the far end of the cabin. I wanted to lock the door and call my parents. My phone had almost no signal, just a single bar blinking weakly in the corner. I kept trying to call, but the connection dropped each time before the call even rang. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I tried to breathe steadily, but every creak in the floor and rustle outside made me jump. I was hyper-aware of the space around me for the first time, how thin the walls were, how easy it might be for someone to slip in unnoticed. The cabin didn't have an alarm system or even deadbolts on the doors, just the old-fashioned locks I could hear clicking every time the wind gusted. I thought about retracing my steps back to the car and driving to the nearest gas station 20 minutes away on that dark highway. But if someone was already out there, waiting outside, I'd be leaving myself exposed. My hands trembled, and I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. The clock on my phone finally showed 11:47 p.m., and the weak signal flickered again. I managed to send a text to my mom, at the cabin. "Something feels off. Call me when you get this." No reply. Suddenly, the back door slammed shut with a sharp bang, making me jump. The wind outside howled louder, and I could swear I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. Not the slow shuffle of animals, but heavier, deliberate steps moving toward the front of the cabin. I grabbed a baseball bat sitting by the bedroom door and crept to the living room window. Peering through the curtains, I saw a figure standing by the front porch, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. The person was tall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over their face. They stood perfectly still, like they were waiting. A cold wave of dread swept over me. The logical part of my brain screamed to call the police, but my phone was dead again. I felt trapped. The figure moved suddenly, stepping into the weak light of a nearby lamp post. I caught a glimpse of sharp eyes scanning the windows, lips moving as if whispering. The person turned toward the side of the house and vanished into the shadows behind the kitchen. I backed away from the window, heart pounding as I locked the front door and double-checked the deadbolt. But deep down, I knew it was useless. I dialed 911 anyway, holding the phone to my ear. The line was dead. The wind outside grew colder, and the shadows lengthened as the night stretched on. I was alone, and someone was out there. Watching. Waiting. The cabin creaked again, and I realized I hadn't heard the back door lock engage. I wasn't safe. Not yet. I didn't mean to stay out so late. I told myself it was just a quick trip to the grocery store and back, but somehow the hours slipped away. It was just past 11 p.m. when I finally pulled into my driveway, the streetlight flickering overhead casting a dull yellow glow over the cracked pavement. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, and the silence felt dense, almost like the air had thickened, pressing against my skin. I grabbed my grocery bags from the back seat and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit me sharper than I expected, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, isolated on one side by a small wooded patch that always seemed darker at night. I took a deep breath and started toward the front door. That's when I noticed the figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was a neighbor walking their dog or someone passing through. But there was something off about the way the person stood, too still, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't see a leash or a pet, just the silhouette of a tall man in a dark jacket. I froze, the grocery bag suddenly feeling heavy in my hands. The man didn't move. Our eyes locked, or at least I thought they did. His face was obscured by the dim light, but I could just make out the glint of something reflective, maybe glasses or the shine of sweat on his skin. I swallowed hard and looked away, telling myself I was overreacting, that it was probably someone waiting for a ride or just passing by. I quickened my pace to the door, fumbling with my keys. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open, stepping inside quickly and closing it behind me. I leaned against it for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. A strange knot was tightening in my stomach, a mix of relief and unease. I set the bags down on the kitchen counter and glanced out the window that faced the trees. The figure was still there, now a bit closer to the driveway, just standing. I blinked, but when I looked again, he was gone. I tried to shake off the feeling that gripped me and started putting the groceries away. I told myself I was just tired and paranoid. The house was locked, the doors bolted, and the windows shut. There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, I felt eyes on me, like a weight pressing from the other side of the glass. I closed the curtains and moved into the living room, trying to focus on the TV, but the screen blurred and the sound felt distant. My mind kept drifting back to the man outside. About 20 minutes later, I heard a soft noise at the back door, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the concrete patio. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped, but then, a few seconds later, it started again. I crept toward the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. Through the small window next to the door, I caught a glimpse of a figure crouching, pulling something along the ground. It was the man. His face was hidden in shadow, but his hands were visible, clenched tightly around the handle of a crowbar. I slammed my fist against the wall, my breath caught in panic. He started trying the door handle, jiggling it slowly, testing it like a lockpick. My mind raced through options: call 911, hide, try to run, but my voice stuck in my throat. I grabbed my phone off the counter and dialed, whispering my address as quietly as possible. The operator's voice was calm and distant, but the seconds felt like hours as I listened to the man outside, his persistence growing. He found a loose panel near the door's frame and began prying it open, the wooden splinters cracking beneath his crowbar. I backed away, heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. My eyes searched the room for anything I could use: knives, a heavy lamp. But the man was already halfway through the door, and I knew I had to act fast. Suddenly, the door gave way with a loud creak, and he stepped inside. His face was harsh and unshaven, eyes wild with desperation or madness, I couldn't tell. Without a word, he lunged toward me. I stumbled backward, knocking over the table as I scrambled toward the stairs. His heavy boots thudded after me, relentless. I slammed my bedroom door shut and twisted the lock, holding my breath as he hammered on it. The phone was still in my hand, and I whispered my location to the dispatcher again, begging for someone to come quickly. The pounding on the door slowed, then stopped, but I knew it was only temporary. Minutes dragged by in suffocating silence, broken only by my shallow breaths. Then, just as I started to hope, I heard the soft tap of footsteps retreating down the hall, then the creak of the front door opening and closing. I sat on the floor, back against the door, trembling. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but by then, the man was gone. Despite their questions and the search, they found no sign of him outside. Only the broken door frame and the scattered groceries remained as proof. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window made me flinch. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me for days afterward. And I knew, somewhere out there, the man was still waiting, patient, silent, and ready to come back. The afternoon had been quiet, too quiet. I was sitting on the cracked wooden bench outside the little grocery store at the corner of Maple and Ninth, scrolling through my phone without really reading anything, just passing time while I waited for Sam to finish his shift. It was early spring, but the breeze still carried a sharp edge, and the sky was a monotonous gray that pressed down on the street like a lid. A few cars passed, the usual mix of beat-up pickups and sedans with peeling paint. The neighborhood had that tired, worn-out feel that made the few bright spots, like the grocery store's freshly painted sign, stand out all the more. I looked up and watched an older man shuffle past, his head down, hands stuffed deep in his coat pockets. He wasn't someone I recognized, but there was something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like he was trying not to attract attention, that made my skin crawl. I shook it off. Maybe it was just the weather, or the fact I'd been on edge since last week when the break-ins started happening in this part of town. The grocery store door slid open with a soft chime, and Sam stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Hey, sorry, took longer than I thought," he said, flashing a tired smile. "No worries," I said, standing up and running a hand through my hair. "Did you see anything weird? The usual crowd?" He shook his head. "Not really. Just some guy hanging around outside who wouldn't stop staring. Looked like he was trying to decide if he wanted to come in or not. Took off while I locked up." I frowned. "Did you get a look at him?" Sam hesitated, then nodded. Clean-shaven, early 30s maybe. Jeans, a hoodie. Nothing that stood out, but he had this intensity. Like he was watching for someone. "Great," I muttered, and we started walking back toward my apartment a few blocks away. The streets felt emptier than usual. The usual kids skating near the park were nowhere to be seen, and the old man I'd noticed earlier was gone too. Just the faint hum of distant traffic mixed with the chirp of early evening birds. As we passed the alley between the barber shop and the laundromat, I caught a glimpse of movement, something just beyond the shadows, where the dim light from the street lamp didn't quite reach. A figure, hunched and still. I blinked. When I looked again, there was nothing. "Did you see that?" I asked, stopping abruptly. Sam slowed, glancing around. "See what?" "Someone just moved over there, in the alley." "I swear." He peered into the shadows, then shrugged. "Maybe a stray cat." I wanted to believe that, but the air had shifted. It was heavier somehow, tighter around my chest. We hurried the last 2 blocks, and the familiar brick facade of my apartment building felt like a strange island of safety. Inside, the hallway was dim and smelled faintly of damp carpet and old paint. The fluorescent light above the elevator flickered, casting uneven shadows against the walls. I kept my keys ready, jabbing the unlock button with trembling fingers. The door swung open with a hesitant creak. Sam stayed close behind me. "You sure you don't want me to wait with you?" he asked. I nodded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm fine. Just tired." Once inside the apartment, I locked the door immediately, double-checked the deadbolt, and closed the curtains. The streetlights outside glowed softly, but I didn't want to see the street. Not like this. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, pretending to read an old magazine Sam had left behind. But my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the dimly lit streets outside. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a noise, a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. I froze, heart hammering. My window was closed, but the sound came from outside. I moved closer and saw the reflection of a figure standing on the sidewalk, just below the window. The streetlight didn't reach far enough to illuminate them clearly, but I could just make out the outline of a person in a hoodie. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every distant siren made me jolt upright. At some point, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, deliberate. I held my breath until they passed. Morning came, pale and gray. I called Sam, and he agreed to come over after his shift. I didn't want to be alone. When he arrived, I told him everything about the man outside the store, the figure in the alley, the tapping on the window, and the footsteps in the hallway. Sam frowned. We should call the cops. I thought about it, but what do I say? That someone's been watching me? That I'm scared to be alone? It sounds crazy. No, it doesn't. People get stalked. It happens. The idea of involving the police made my stomach twist, but part of me knew he was right. Later that day, I double-checked all the locks, even taped the windows shut with masking tape, as if that would keep someone out. I kept my phone close, and every time I heard a noise outside, I flinched. By evening, Sam suggested we drive around the block a few times, to see if anyone suspicious was hanging about. The first time we circled, the streets were empty. The second time, a car slowed down behind us at a stop sign, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. The driver's side window rolled down just a bit, but I couldn't see the person's face. The car stopped beside us, then sped off when Sam accelerated. We both sat in silence for a moment before Sam said, "That was definitely the guy who was outside the store." I swallowed hard. The neighborhood I'd always thought of as safe was starting to feel like a trap. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every passerby's glance felt loaded with something I couldn't place. That night, I didn't even bother pulling the curtains. Instead, I taped a note to the inside of the glass. "I know you're watching. Leave me alone." The next day, the note was gone. Instead, in its place was a thin scratch along the glass, just long enough to be noticed but not enough to shatter the window. The message was clear. I never did find out who had been following me, or why. But from that day on, I never looked at the streets the same way again. Every corner, every darkened alley, every quiet porch became a potential threat. And sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my own. The house was quiet when I got back, colder than I expected for a late spring evening. I'd left the windows open all day, hoping the breeze would clear out the stale smell from the humid air that had settled in after the rain. My car pulled into the gravel driveway just as the sun was slipping behind the trees, turning the sky a dull gray. I noticed a single porch light flickering, the bulb struggling against the fading daylight, but I didn't think much of it. It was probably just old wiring, like everything else in this house. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, listening. The usual creaks of the old place settled around me, the pipes shifting, the wood expanding after the rain, but there was something else I couldn't place. A faint, irregular tapping coming from the back of the house. I froze, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch brushing against the siding in the wind. The house was surrounded by trees, and the storm from earlier had left everything damp and heavy. I peeked out the kitchen window, the one that looked onto the narrow side yard. Moonlight sifted through the leaves, casting moving shadows, but the yard was empty. No sign of anyone or anything. I shook my head, blaming the tiredness from work. The late shift always left me jumpy. I locked the door behind me and went to check the back porch. The tapping stopped abruptly as I stepped outside. The wood beneath my feet was slick from the rain, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. I scanned the yard again, slower this time, but found nothing. Just the whisper of the wind in the treetops. I pulled the door closed and bolted it. Back inside, I tried to shake off the feeling that wasn't quite right. I went into the living room and switched on the floor lamp. The light spilled into the corners, chasing away the shadows. My phone buzzed an email alert from work, and I shoved a creeping unease into the back of my mind. Maybe it was just my imagination. I sat down on the couch and reached for the remote, but paused as I noticed the television was already on. The screen showed static, no sound. I definitely remembered turning it off before I left that morning. Heart pounding, I stood and walked over. The remote's batteries were still in place, the power button off. Someone had turned it on manually. A slow dread crept up my spine. I moved toward the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my bare feet. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had closed it before I left. A shadow shifted inside. I flicked on the light. The room was empty. Then I heard it again, the tapping. Louder this time, coming from inside the closet. I swallowed, my throat dry. The closet door was barely cracked. I reached out and pulled it open. Nothing. No one. Just a pile of old coats and boxes. But then I noticed something on the floor, a small, folded piece of paper, sharply creased like it had been carried around for a while. I picked it up, heart thudding, and unfolded it carefully. The message was scrawled in messy handwriting. I know you're alone. I dropped the note and backed out of the room. The weight of it pressed down on me, cold and heavy. Whoever had left it had been inside the house while I was at work. The thought was unbearable. I looked around for a weapon, anything I could use, but found only the lamp I'd turned on earlier. I locked the bedroom door, wedging the dresser against it. Then I went to the kitchen and double-locked the back door. My hands trembled as I checked the windows and shutters, making sure every point of entry was secure. I wanted to call the police, but the idea of explaining this, how someone got inside without me noticing, felt humiliating. What if they thought I was overreacting? I needed proof. I decided to check the security camera I'd installed a few months ago. It was an old model with limited storage, but it was something. The small monitor sat on the living room shelf. I switched it on and scrolled through the footage from the day. For hours, nothing unusual. Then, just after noon, a shadow appeared. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure moved deliberately, sliding through the side yard toward the back porch. It was a man, average height, wearing a hoodie and jeans. The footage was grainy, but I could see him fiddling with the lock for a moment before pushing the door open. He stayed inside for nearly 20 minutes, pacing the hallway and peering into rooms. Then he left the same way, disappearing into the trees. My breath hitched. I rewound to the moment the man entered. I was at work then, sitting in the break room, which I could prove. But still, he had been inside my home. Alone. I turned off the monitor and sat back down, trying to steady my shaking hands. How had he gotten past the front door? The lock was changed last month, and the windows were closed. I felt violated, exposed in the one place I should have been safe. I thought about calling a locksmith again, maybe installing better security, but a small, bitter voice in my head whispered that it wouldn't matter. Whoever it was could come back any time. He might already be watching me. The tapping started again, this time at the front door. Slow, deliberate. I was frozen, listening as the sound echoed through the quiet house. I didn't dare look outside. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the tapping stopped. I waited, breath shallow, every muscle tense. After a few minutes, I crept to the window and peered out into the dark driveway. Nothing. The gravel was still undisturbed. I locked the door one more time and sat down in the living room, clutching the lamp like a lifeline. My phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. You left the back unlocked. I stared at the screen, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I knew then that this wasn't random. Whoever this was, they knew me. They knew where I lived. And they wanted me to be afraid. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening to the silence, waiting for the tapping to start again. Story 5, The Secret Beneath Hollow Creek House. I didn't think much of the late shift until the streets started emptying out around midnight. The diner where I worked was one of those all-night joints, the kind that catered mostly to truckers and the occasional drifter passing through town. I'd done the graveyard shift for months, long enough to know the rhythm of the place, to recognize the difference between a regular and someone passing through. On this night, the usual hum of clinking dishes and low conversation had thinned to almost nothing. My manager had taken a rare break, leaving me alone behind the counter. Around 12:30 a.m., a man I hadn't seen before came in. He was tall, with a heavy coat zipped all the way up despite it being a warm spring night. I noticed his boots scuffed up and wet, like he'd been stomping through something muddy. He didn't look like he belonged anywhere near this part of town. When he sat down at the counter, I felt the first flicker of unease, but I chalked it up to the usual stranger anxiety. The diner was open to all sorts, and I reminded myself that I was probably overthinking. He ordered black coffee, no food, and pulled out a crumpled paperback from his pocket. The cover was torn, and the pages yellowed. I caught a glimpse of a title, something about a lost trail or forgotten woods. He read for a while, eyes flicking up occasionally to glance around the room, not quite settling on anything. More like scanning, I guess. As I wiped down the counter, I noticed that every time the door opened with a jingle, he would tense, his head snapping toward the entrance like he expected to see someone specific. The streetlights outside cast long, wavering shadows through the window, and his face was half lit, half swallowed by darkness. He never smiled or spoke beyond ordering his coffee. His presence felt hollow, like he was waiting for something but wasn't sure what. About an hour later, I caught sight of movement outside the window opposite the counter. A figure was standing on the sidewalk, almost too still to be real. My heart jumped when the man at the counter abruptly shut his book and stood up, pressing something into the palm of his hand, maybe a note, before slipping out the door without a word. I blinked, watching him disappear into the night. The figure on the sidewalk had vanished. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks after so many hours of fluorescent light and caffeine, but the cold prickling on my neck wouldn't let me forget. I glanced at the clock, 1:45 a.m., and forced myself to focus on the few remaining customers, 2 truckers chatting about their routes, a lone woman scrolling on her phone. Then I noticed the front door open again, but this time no one walked in. The bell jingled faintly, though the breeze outside was still. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and looked around. Nothing. Just the empty street, the street lamp flickering overhead like it might give out any second. I locked the door behind me, a reflex I didn't usually bother with during business hours, but tonight felt different. The air outside was thick with humidity and something else I couldn't place, an acrid smell, like burnt rubber or scorched earth. As I turned back toward the diner, I saw a figure retreating around the corner, moving too fast to make out any features. Something about the way the person moved was off. Not hurried or panicked, but deliberate, almost stalking. I swallowed hard and went back inside, bolting the door and double-checking the locks. My hands trembled, but I tried to calm myself with the normal sounds, the sputtering neon sign, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the city at night. Minutes later, the power flickered once, plunging the diner into darkness for just a second before the lights flicked back on. Everyone paused, truckers, woman, me. The man who had been reading, the figure I'd seen outside, they weren't here anymore. Neither had left a trace except for the lingering feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a pair of drifters or people passing through town, looking for trouble or just shelter from the night. But the way the air felt heavy, as if the shadows themselves were pressing in, made me doubt that. I kept glancing at the windows, waiting for the next bell to jingle. My shift would end in an hour, and I was counting every minute, every second. The normalcy of the diner, the clatter of plates and the smell of burnt coffee felt distant now, as though I was trapped in a space that was slowly closing in on me. I wanted to call my manager back, ask her to come in early, but my phone was dead. I hadn't plugged it in during my shift, and the charger was buried in my locker. I debated running to the back room to get it, but the thought of moving away from the counter, away from the windows, froze me solid. The silence was broken by a soft tap, tap, tap coming from the window beside me. I whipped around so fast my chair scraped against the floor. No one was there. The rain started lightly outside, pattering against the glass, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I hurried to the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside into the warm, damp night. The street was empty again, save for a small crumpled piece of paper pressed against the doorframe by a raindrop. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. Written in neat block letters was a single sentence, "You can't leave yet." My heart slammed so hard I thought it might burst. The streetlight flickered above me, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the edge of vision. My hand shook as I stuffed the note into my pocket and hurried back inside, locking the door twice behind me. The diner felt colder now, the air thick with the smell of wet paper and something else, fear. I sat back down behind the counter, eyes glued to the door, waiting for whatever would come next. The night was far from over. The bus was nearly empty when I climbed aboard around 9:15 that Friday night, the streetlights casting long, tired shadows through the grimy windows. It was past the last rush hour, but not late enough for the night crowds to really thin out. I settled into a cracked plastic seat near the middle, trying not to draw attention to myself as I pulled my coat tighter around my neck. The city had that familiar damp chill, the kind that seeped into your bones, and I was eager to get home to my small apartment tucked in one of those old brick buildings on the east side. I didn't want to think about the walk from the bus stop, a few blocks through a dimly lit residential area that had a reputation for petty crime but nothing too serious. At least, that's what I told myself. The bus creaked and groaned, the engine lurching forward with a reluctant rumble. I stared out the window, watching blurred shapes of late-night diners and a few stragglers heading home. A man got on a few stops after me, a tall figure with a long coat buttoned up to his chin, a wool cap pulled down low, so all I could really see was the outline of his face. He didn't sit down. Instead, he stood near the back, gripping one of the overhead rails, his eyes scanning the bus as if he was counting each passenger. I tried not to meet his gaze, but something about the way he kept shifting his weight from foot to foot made the air feel thicker, heavier. The bus slowed as it reached the stop where a small cluster of shops stood closed for the night. A woman with a stroller stepped on, nodding briefly at the driver without a word. The man in the coat's head jerked slightly toward her, and for a moment I thought he might say something, but he stayed silent. The woman shuffled toward the front, away from him. The atmosphere on the bus grew awkward, like a silent tension you could almost reach out and touch. I glanced at my phone, the screen cracked across the corner but still functioning. No missed calls, no messages, just the cold glow of the time. Good. No one expecting me to answer. I tucked it back into my pocket and looked back up. The man had moved, now closer to me, standing in the aisle, the overhead light casting slivers of shadow across his face. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something there, a flicker of something unreadable. I shifted in my seat, my heart picking up pace, but I told myself to relax. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe this bus was the last ride home for both of us. I focused on the low hum of the engine and the creak of the suspension as the road curved. The next stop was mine. I stood up, smoothing my coat, and headed toward the door. The man followed, stepping down the aisle just a few paces behind me. I felt the pressure of his presence suddenly, like the air between us was shrinking. At the door, I hesitated. He was close now, too close, and I noticed a faint smell of something sharp, like metal and sweat. I stepped off the bus onto the cracked sidewalk, the chill biting at my face. I heard his footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate. I glanced back. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but the way he kept pace was unnerving. I quickened my steps, my breath visible in the cold night air, hitting uneven rhythms as I tried to stay calm. The street was mostly deserted, the occasional sound of a distant car or a dog barking breaking the silence. Ahead, the streetlights flickered once, twice, then stabilized, bathing the sidewalk in a harsh yellow glow. I kept walking, eyes darting to every window, every side street. The man did the same, never lagging, never speeding up, just matching me, step for step. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, relief flooding me for a second until I saw it was just a spam notification. I stuffed the phone back, hands trembling slightly. I had to get to the corner where the light was brightest, where people might still be around. But the street stretched on longer than I remembered, the buildings older and more run down the farther I went. Then, a sound, a soft scrape against the pavement, like a shoe catching on a loose stone. I stopped, heart hammering, and turned sharply. The man was a few feet behind, hands in his pockets, face blank. His eyes locked on mine again, this time with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "Are you lost?" My voice came out shakier than intended. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, and I caught the glint of something in his hand, a thin, straight object reflecting the streetlight. My breath hitched. I cursed silently at myself for not noticing sooner. The object was a screwdriver. I stepped back, scanning for a place to run, anywhere open. My apartment was just a few blocks away, but the street was empty. I forced myself to keep moving, not breaking eye contact, not giving him any sign of fear. But inside, panic was rising fast. A door opened a little ahead, a convenience store, its neon sign buzzing weakly. I bolted toward it, the man behind me now sprinting. The night cracked with the sound of his footsteps pounding the pavement. I reached the door, pushed it open, and slammed it behind me, the warmth and fluorescent light flooding over me in a wave of relief. The clerk looked up, surprised to see someone so late. "Please," I gasped, "call the police." He nodded quickly, reaching for the phone behind the counter. I peeked out the window. The man stood across the street, watching, his screwdriver still in hand. His breath was visible in the cold, steady and calm as if nothing had changed. His eyes were locked on me. I sank down onto a plastic chair near the door, the chill fading but the dread settling deeper in my chest. The clerk's voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the trembling in my own as I told him everything. The bus, the footsteps, the screwdriver. Outside, the man didn't move. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the yellow street lamp, waiting. I realized then that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The rain was coming down hard when I left the diner. It was one of those sudden, late summer thunderstorms that seem to spring out of nowhere, the kind that makes streets slick and turns the night into a blur of reflections and shadows. I had stayed longer than I meant to, sitting under the flickering neon sign that hummed above the diner's door, watching raindrops race down the windows like tiny, desperate runners. The roads were nearly empty, except for the occasional car splashing past in the distance, headlights smeared by the wet glass. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and started walking, my shoes squishing softly against the wet pavement. The bus stop was a good 15 minutes away, and I wasn't about to call a cab in the middle of the night. The rain was steady but not cold, wrapping the air in a damp, heavy cloak. I liked that there was a kind of quiet in it, like the world was pressing pause. I told myself I could make it. I always made it. About halfway to the stop, I noticed a figure leaning against the brick wall of the closed hardware store. He was wearing a dark hoodie, pulled low over his face, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. At first, I thought maybe he was just trying to stay dry, but there was something off, too still, too deliberate. I kept a polite distance as I passed, but he didn't move or even glance my way. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. I quickened my pace, the steady patter of rain muffling my footsteps. The streetlights flickered above, their yellow circles of light struggling to cut through the darkness. The man stayed where he was, and for a moment, I thought he might follow me. I stopped, pretending to check my phone, and looked back. He was still there, unmoving, as if he had been waiting for something or someone. My heart picked up speed. I debated turning around, crossing the street, or maybe slipping into a convenience store to wait out the storm. But the thought of shelter felt like admitting vulnerability, and I hated that feeling. I told myself it was just coincidence, just a guy trying to stay dry. People like that existed. I wasn't in danger. Not yet. I kept walking. The bus stop was a small metal shelter, with peeling paint and a bench that looked like it had seen better days. I slid inside and pressed my back against the cold surface, the wet of my coat seeping through. The shelter's light buzzed overhead, flickering once and then steadying. Across the street, the hardware store's windows were dark, the silhouette of the figure gone. I pulled my phone out, hoping for a message from Jake, anything that would remind me I wasn't alone. But the screen was empty. No calls, no texts, just a dull glow illuminating my face. I glanced around, the wet streets stretching out in both directions. The bus was supposed to come in 10 minutes, but that felt like a lifetime. Then, a noise from behind me, a soft shuffle, a scrape against the pavement. My breath caught. I turned slowly, expecting nothing, but there was no one in the shelter with me. Just the rain, the empty street, and the distant hum of a car engine. I tried to shake the growing tightness in my chest. Maybe an animal? A stray cat? I told myself it wasn't worth worrying over. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate tread on the wet concrete, coming from the alleyway just to the left of the bus stop. My eyes snapped to the dark opening. The alley was a narrow gap between two buildings, littered with trash and broken glass that glittered like shards of ice in the streetlight. The sound was faint but unmistakable, footsteps, heavier than mine, moving steadily toward me. I swallowed hard and looked around. The street was empty except for me, the alley, and the rain. The bus's schedule was taped to the side of the shelter, yellowed and curling, but I wasn't paying attention to it anymore. I was measuring time by the slow approach of those footsteps. I considered running, but my body felt heavy, anchored by fear. The footsteps grew louder, echoing now against the buildings, and I could hear the faint slap of wet shoes on concrete. Then, another noise, the soft rustle of fabric, the scrape of a bag being shifted or adjusted. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling slightly. The bus could come at any moment, but I wasn't sure I wanted to get on it with whoever was coming out of that alley. The rain was still falling around me, muffling sounds but also masking my own movements. The figure stepped into the dim light of the street, tall and broad-shouldered, face obscured by a low cap this time. He didn't say anything. He just kept walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. "Do you have a cigarette?" he asked, voice rough and low. I shook my head, unable to speak. My throat felt dry, tight. He took another step, then another, closing the distance between us. I could see his eyes now, dark, hard, scanning me like I was some problem to be solved or a challenge to be weighed. "I've been waiting for a while," he said, nodding toward the hardware store. "Waiting?" I thought. Waiting for me? I didn't answer. The bus's headlights appeared around the corner, bright and suddenly close. Relief surged through me, so strong it was almost physical. The man glanced at it, then back at me, and for a moment, his expression flickered, a muscle in his jaw tensed, and he turned away without another word, disappearing back into the shadows of the alley. I didn't move until the bus came to a stop and the doors hissed open. I climbed in, breath heaving, heart pounding loud enough I was sure everyone could hear it. The bus was nearly empty, the driver nodding at me as I sat down in the back. Outside, the rain was still falling, relentless and cold. But inside, the lights were warm, the hum of the engine a steady comfort. I pressed my forehead against the window, watching the dark street slip away behind us, wondering who that man was, why he'd been waiting, and if I would see him again. The driver glanced at me once more before pulling away, and I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. For the first time, the night didn't feel like something I could control. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the power went out. It was a cloudy Thursday afternoon, the kind of dull, gray day that made the fluorescent light above my kitchen sink seem unbearably bright. The sudden silence was jarring. The hum of the refrigerator, the quiet buzz of the laptop on the dining table, even the faint sound of cars passing on the street, all of it just stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe the breaker had flipped, but when I looked at the panel, everything was still on. The whole block was dark. I stepped outside onto the porch, the air cool and wet from a light drizzle that had started minutes before. Across the street, the houses were just as silent, their windows dark. The road was empty except for a solitary sedan parked a little ways down, engine running. The brake lights glowed faintly in the mist. I squinted against the dim light, wondering if someone was waiting for someone else or maybe just idling to stay warm. The rain picked up, sharp and cold. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and headed back inside. The house felt suddenly smaller, the usual hum of appliances replaced by the thudding silence of nothing working. I lit a candle on the kitchen table and opened my laptop to check my phone signal, hoping to get some information about the outage. No bars. Not even one. The Wi-Fi was useless without power, and the cellular network must have been down or overloaded. I tried not to panic. Maybe this was just a routine blackout. I'd seen it happen before, usually fixed in a few hours. Still, the sinking feeling in my chest grew as I noticed something else. The sedan was gone. The street was quiet again. I glanced down at my phone once more. The clock blinked 3:57 p.m., frozen. I set the phone on the table and tried to focus on the candle's flicker, but the room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch too long on the walls. I pulled the curtains back slightly to look outside again. Nothing. No movement. Then I heard it. A faint tapping on the front window. My heart jumped. The sound was soft, irregular, like someone drumming their fingers, but just enough to grab attention. I froze for a second, listening. The rain masked any footsteps or voices, but the tapping came again, more deliberate this time. "Hello?" I called quietly, my voice sounding small in the empty house. No answer. The tapping stopped. I walked over to the window and peered out through the glass, but the street was empty. The rain blurred the view. There was no one there. Maybe it was a bird. Or just a branch scraping in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but my hands were shaking slightly as I closed the curtain and locked the window. I considered calling someone, anyone, but there was no signal. I didn't even know if the outage was local or citywide. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios, and that's when I realized I hadn't checked the back door. I moved cautiously into the living room, every shadow seeming deeper and more threatening. The flickering candle on the kitchen table was the only light apart from the weak gray from outside. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. The back door was supposed to be locked. I always checked it before bed. I walked over and tried the handle. Locked. Good. But then I noticed something I hadn't before, a muddy footprint just outside the door, visible on the threshold. It was fresh, the edges still wet from the rain. The sole had an unusual tread pattern, thick lines with small diamond shapes in between. I knelt down to study it, heart pounding. What was someone doing out there? I didn't hear any footsteps now, no rustling in the bushes or the garden. Just the rain, steady and cold. I pulled the door tighter, checked the deadbolt again, then backed away. I thought about calling the police, but without a signal, that was pointless. I had a landline, but the phone was dead without power. The house felt like a trap. I went back to the kitchen, trying to steady my breathing. I turned to the window again, and my eyes caught movement across the street. A figure was standing on the sidewalk, just beyond the glow of a street lamp. The streetlight was dead. No, it was flickering. Shadows shifted around the figure's legs, blending with the wet pavement. The person was dressed in dark clothes with a hood pulled low, head tilted slightly, as if looking directly at my window. I froze. The figure didn't move. Just stood there, silent. I blinked, and they were gone. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't tell if it was fear or frustration that made me want to scream at myself for letting my imagination run wild. Still, the footprints outside the back door, the tapping on the window, the hooded figure, they didn't add up to nothing. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer, its batteries thankfully still good, and checked the locks on every door and window. All were secure, but the sense of vulnerability didn't leave me. I sat back down at the table with the candle and flashlight, the flame trembling as the wind pressed against the house. Time dragged on. Then the tapping returned, but this time on the glass of the back door. I didn't move. Then a soft voice, barely louder than the tapping, whispered from outside. "Hey, can you help me?" I swallowed hard. "Who is it?" I asked, voice cracking. No answer. The voice was low, calm, but something in it didn't feel right. It wasn't a neighbor, this was a quiet street, and I'd never heard anyone call out like that before. I edged toward the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, the beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I tried to peer through the small window on the door, but the glass was fogged and streaked with rain, distorting the view. "Please," the voice said again. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to stay inside and call the cops as soon as the power came back. But my throat was dry, and I was too scared to simply wait in silence. Then I heard it, the sound of a car starting up a few houses down. The engine roared briefly, then sped away. The person outside said nothing more. I pulled the curtains closed and locked the door again. I sat down, shaking now, the candle guttering in the draft. Minutes passed. The rain stopped. The street was quiet. I told myself it was over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The power flickered back on moments later, and the hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic filled the house again. I stared at the locked doors and windows, my mind spinning with what-ifs. Who had been outside? Why had they vanished without a trace? And was this only the beginning? I was at the laundromat again, the one 3 blocks from my apartment where the machines were almost always free on weekday afternoons. It was a small, boxy building with flickering fluorescent lights and cracked linoleum floors, the kind of place that smelled like damp fabric softener and old pennies. The hum of dryers and the occasional rattle of change in the coin slots made the air feel sterile and monotonous. I always told myself it was a necessary chore, but after what had happened the night before, I was nervous to be out in public at all. The routine was supposed to be straightforward: wash the clothes, wait 45 minutes, dry, and go home. Nothing complicated. I had left work early, hoping to get everything done before the evening rush added more strangers sitting or standing around, staring at their phones. The room was almost empty when I arrived, save for a middle-aged man with a buzz cut who was folding clothes on the far side, and a teenage girl with oversized headphones who sat slouched against the wall. Neither looked particularly threatening, but I still felt exposed. I sorted my laundry into 2 washers, dropped the quarters in, and set the timers. The washers began their grinding cycle, and I wandered over to the folding table, sitting down to run through emails on my phone. The laundromat's windows were fogged along the edges, but I could still see outside mostly the gray street and a few parked cars. The dull light from the overcast sky made the place feel even more closed in, like I was inside a glass box. That's when I noticed the man with the buzz cut had stopped folding. He was staring at me, and when our eyes met, he didn't look away. There wasn't an immediate threat in his face, but something was off. His gaze was too steady, like he was trying to memorize every detail about me. I forced a polite smile and looked down at my phone. Maybe I was imagining it. The dryer's finished. I stood, grabbed the wet clothes, and moved to the row of dryers. I didn't want to stay around that man any longer than necessary. As I loaded the dryer, I heard the teenage girl beside me put her headphones down. She said in a low voice, "Hey, do you think that guy is?" I cut her off with a nervous laugh. "Probably just waiting for his laundry, right?" She shrugged but didn't put her headphones back on. Instead, she kept watching him. I tried to keep my focus on the machines, but the man had stood up and moved toward the exit. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he wanted to be seen but also wanted to make sure I noticed. He wasn't carrying anything, and there was no sign of any obvious weapon. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and glanced at the clock on the wall. 5 minutes until the dryer cycles ended. My phone buzzed a message from my sister. "Everything okay? You sounded weird last night." I typed back quickly, "Just tired." "Laundry now." The man was gone. I exhaled, feeling foolish for letting my mind wander. The teenage girl packed up her bag and left without a word. I was alone again, save for the low hum of the dryers. When the machines beeped, I grabbed my bag and made for the door. Outside, the street was quieter than usual, but there was a chill in the air that made me zip up my jacket. The man with the buzz cut was leaning against the street lamp across the street, smoking a cigarette. His eyes flicked to me as I passed. I walked faster. Turning the corner toward home, I kept checking behind me. A few blocks down, I saw him again, this time standing under a porch light, his face half hidden in shadow. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. My pulse sped up. I ducked into a convenience store, pretending to browse aisles I didn't need. The fluorescent lights inside felt harsher, the smell of stale chips and cleaning chemicals making my stomach turn. The clerk was an older woman with tired eyes who noticed my nervousness. "You okay, hon?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Yeah." Just scowled. Out the window, the man lingered on the sidewalk. He didn't come in. After 5 minutes, he walked away. I waited a little longer before stepping back outside. The street was empty. I hurried home, double-locked the door, and peered through the peephole. Nothing. I slid down the door, trying to steady my breathing. That night, I kept every light on and sat with my back to the wall, phone in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. The man hadn't called, texted, or tried to contact me in any way, but I knew it wasn't over. Something about his silent watchfulness told me he wasn't done yet. Morning came sluggishly, the pale light seeping through the curtains like a hesitant promise. I didn't sleep. Instead, I stared at my phone, half expecting a message that never arrived. Hours crept by, each one heavier than the last, until finally, the ringing shattered the silence. My hand trembled as I answered. A low, rasping whisper breathed through the line, "You can't hide." The call ended before I could respond. Heart pounding, I knew the nightmare had just begun. I glanced nervously around the room, shadows stretching like claws. The voice wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. I had to move, but where could I go when the darkness itself was hunting me? Story 6, Midnight Watcher in an Empty Office. I left work later than usual that night, the sky already swallowed by thick clouds that promised rain. The grocery store had emptied an hour before closing, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead as I stacked the last few crates of avocados. My shift had been slow, but strangely tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. Sometimes when nights like that happen, I tell myself it's just a kind of mood that sticks to a place, nothing more. I was desperate for that to be true, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The parking lot was nearly deserted. A few cars, scattered under the weak yellow glow of street lamps, looked like ghosts in the shadows. I pulled my coat tighter, the wind tugging at the loose ends. My phone buzzed in my pocket, text from my roommate saying she wasn't going to be home for the next few days, and I shoved the phone back, irritation flickering in my chest. I hated being alone, especially with the store so far from the main road, tucked between a rundown gas station and a shuttered hardware store. At night, the area folded into itself, walls and darkness pressing close. I locked the back door behind me, the cold metal handle slippery in my grip. The street was empty except for a single figure sitting on the curb across the lot. He was hunched over, head down, the light from his phone casting a pale glow on his face. I didn't recognize him, didn't recognize anyone in this part of town. Normally, I have shrugged and gone around, but tonight something made me pause. Maybe it was the way his shoulders twitched, like he was shaking off a chill, or the faint sound of murmuring that seemed too low for a phone call. Or maybe it was the way his eyes flicked up just long enough for me to catch the edge of something sharp and unreadable before he looked away. I stepped toward my car, the gravel crunching under boots that suddenly felt too heavy. As I unlocked the door, the figure stood up quickly, moving toward the shadow of the hardware store. My heart caught in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, just some kid trying to stay out of the rain, but my fingers trembled as I slid into the driver's seat. The heater sputtered to life, and I kept the doors locked as I pulled out onto the street, the car's headlights barely cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in. On the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, someone walking parallel behind me on the cracked sidewalk, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn jacket. I sped up. The footsteps didn't quicken, didn't fall back. They matched me, step for step. My breathing came in sharp, uneven bursts as I turned onto the main road. The streetlights flickered, and I was suddenly very aware of how isolated this section was. The houses were spaced far apart, most with dark windows shuttered tight, their lawns overgrown and wild. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, pacing as if they had nowhere else to go but here. A part of me wanted to believe they were just another late-night wanderer, maybe lost or waiting for a ride. But the way their head kept turning, like they were watching me, made my stomach twist. I remembered the extra set of keys I kept hidden in the glove compartment and unlocked the car door as I pulled into my driveway. The house was a small, boxy thing, older than the others on the street, with peeling paint and a crooked porch light. I fumbled with the lock, hands slick with sweat. Inside, I slammed the door and twisted the deadbolt before leaning against it, chest heaving. The silence inside was thick, almost suffocating. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden floor settling. I told myself to breathe, to calm down. I checked the locks on the windows, the front one near the porch, the kitchen window overlooking the alleyway behind the house. Everything was secure. I was about to tell myself to let it go, but then I heard it, the soft tap, tap, tap at the back window. My head snapped toward the sound. I crept into the kitchen, heartbeat pounding loud enough to drown out everything else. The window was fogged over, the glass cool beneath my fingertips. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see the alley, dark and empty except for a figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch light's reach. I blinked, trying to make out details. The man from the parking lot, his face half hidden beneath a cap pulled low. He was staring directly at me. I slammed the curtain closed and backed away. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard, every warning I'd ever ignored. When I called the police, my voice barely made it past a whisper, but they promised to send someone out. I stayed awake in the living room, the TV muted, lights on every lamp in the house. Hours passed. The figure never left. When the dawn finally cracked the sky with pale gray, I peeked out the window again. The alley was empty. No footprints in the wet grass. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But the front door was unlocked. And I was certain I hadn't forgotten to lock it. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob, heart pounding. Someone had been inside. The night had settled in fully by the time I left the library. The street lamps flickered unevenly, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. I tucked my scarf tighter around my neck against the cold and pulled my coat closer, the brisk autumn air feeling sharper than I remembered. The late October chill wasn't unusual, but something in the way the wind shoved past me made the silence feel heavier. The usual hum of distant traffic was subdued, as if the whole neighborhood had been swallowed into a kind of quiet pause. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. It was just past 10, which wasn't late, but late enough that the city felt less familiar. The branch of the library on 12th Street closed early on Sundays, but I liked to linger on rare occasions, getting lost in the stacks until the cleaning crew started edging me out. I had been looking through some dusty history books, the kind no one checked out anymore. The walk back to my apartment was supposed to be easy, just under a mile along well-lit streets, with a few convenience stores and a small park along the way. Usually, I enjoyed this kind of solitary walk. It gave me time to unwind after a day of work and studying. But tonight, that comfort didn't come. I passed the empty bus stop near the corner of 14th and Maple, glancing at the faded schedule board. The peeling posters fluttered in the wind. That's when I noticed the man. He was standing just beyond the shelter, half hidden in shadow, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a heavy jacket. I didn't recognize him, but that wasn't unusual. The neighborhood was always changing, people drifting in and out. What made me pause was the way he was staring. Not just a glance, but a fixed, unblinking gaze that felt like it was drilling into me. I quickened my pace, my boots clicking on the concrete. The man didn't move. Not even when I was a few steps ahead. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was waiting for his bus, or maybe he was just standing there, lost in thought. But a knot tightened in my stomach. When I reached the small park, I heard the soft scuffle of leaves behind me. I turned quickly, but it was just a stray cat darting under a bench. My breath came out in short bursts, misting in the cold air. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I pulled my keys out of my pocket and checked my phone again. No signal. I cursed under my breath. The park was always a dead zone for cell reception. I told myself I could make it the rest of the way home, but the thought of being unreachable if something happened made me nervous. I started walking through the park, choosing the lit path that cut diagonally across it. The streetlights were old and some didn't work, leaving patches of darkness between pools of yellow light. The trees rustled in the wind, their branches scraping against each other with a dry crackle. Somewhere close, a dog barked sharply. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but shifting shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself it was just my imagination. Halfway through the park, the path curved near a pond. The water was still, black and smooth, reflecting the sickly glow of the street lamps. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I stopped and looked around, the silence pressing in. Whoever had been behind me was gone now, or maybe just waiting in the dark. I forced myself to move on, picking up my pace. I wasn't far from the edge of the park now, where the street opened up again. But then I heard it, a low voice, close enough to make my blood run cold. "Hey!" I froze. The voice was male, rough, and just behind me. I spun around. In the faint light, a figure stood near the bushes, half shrouded by shadow. I hadn't seen him before. "Hey," he repeated, stepping closer, hands raised slightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I shook my head, the knot in my stomach tightening to a fist. "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry." He stepped forward, and suddenly I could see the face more clearly, a man in his early 30s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His eyes looked tired but sharp, and there was something off about the way he smiled. Not friendly, exactly, more like he was sizing me up. "Come on," he said, voice low. "Just a minute. I won't hurt you." My fingers tightened around my keys, the jagged edges digging into my palm. "No, thank you." He took another step, and I turned and broke into a run. My boots pounded against the pavement as I sprinted out of the park, adrenaline surging through me. I didn't look back until I was well past the last trees and onto the street again. No sign of him. But the feeling of being hunted didn't go away. I slowed to a walk, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what just happened. My mind raced with questions. Who was that man? Why did he approach me? Had he been following me through the park? The street was quiet, too quiet. I kept my head down and moved faster, scanning every shadow. When I finally reached the corner where my building stood, I almost ran up the steps and through the door. Inside, the familiar scent of old wood and cleaning detergent wrapped around me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I locked the door behind me, double-checked it, and leaned against it for a long moment. The hallway light flickered overhead, buzzing softly. Outside, the wind stirred fallen leaves against the windows. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone still had no signal. I sat down in the small entryway, trying to steady my shaking hands. That's when I heard the knock. Soft. Almost tentative. My heart slammed in my chest. I told myself it was probably a neighbor late night, maybe they'd forgotten their keys. But my voice cracked when I said it out loud. The knock came again, quicker this time, louder. I crept to the peephole and looked out. No one. Just the empty hallway, dim and silent. I waited, breath shallow, every nerve on fire, but the knocking didn't come again. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then, faint footsteps echoed down the hall. Slow. Deliberate. And stopping just outside my door. The bus was late, again, when I got out of the grocery store. The sky was a dull gray, thinning clouds that promised rain by evening. I checked my phone, no signal. The little outpost I was in had bad reception anyway, but I'd hoped to at least get a text to let Mark know I was heading back. I shoved my bags into the cart and wheeled it toward the stop, the groan of the wheels dragging over cracked pavement the only sound besides the distant hum of traffic down the main road. The bus shelter was empty, a metal frame with a faded schedule taped inside a glass panel, a schedule that didn't seem to mean much anymore. I glanced up and down the street, the small dozen houses clustered unevenly along the single lane. A few porch lights flickered on as dusk crept in. I could see the diner at the corner, its neon sign blinking a slow, tired rhythm. Inside, the silhouette of the cook leaned over the counter, wiping something with a rag. I pulled my coat tighter around me, the air sharp against my skin. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable smell of diesel and wet earth. The cart scraped against the curb as I shifted my weight, waiting. A black sedan rolled past, windows tinted too dark to see inside. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the side mirror, a man, middle-aged, clean-shaven, eyes hidden behind dark glasses even in the failing light. The car slowed just a little, then sped up and disappeared around the bend. I shook off the unease. It was probably nothing. Just a guy who'd passed through. These parts had their share of strangers, especially lately, since the old factory shut down and people started moving out. The town was shrinking, and the ones who stayed seemed to watch each other a little more carefully. The bus came 30 minutes late, rattling to a stop with a wheeze. I loaded my bags and pulled the door closed behind me, relieved to be on the move. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and old upholstery. A few other passengers sat scattered along the bench seats, none looking my way. A teenage boy with earbuds tapped rhythmically on his phone, a woman in a cheap windbreaker stared out the window with tired eyes, and a man in a trucker hat snored softly near the back. As we pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched, maybe from the shadows behind the bakery or the empty lot where the weeds had overtaken the playground. I tried to focus on the road ahead, the patchy orange streetlights flickering on one by one, illuminating the cracked sidewalks and peeling paint of shuttered stores. About 10 minutes in, the bus made a sudden, unscheduled stop at a street I didn't recognize. The driver muttered something under his breath before opening the door. A man stepped on, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. He didn't say a word but moved to the seat directly behind me. I swallowed hard, trying not to look back. The bus started moving again, the man's heavy breaths audible in the quiet. I felt his eyes on me, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I told myself he was just another passenger, probably tired and keeping to himself, but the way his hand rested casually on the seat in front of him felt deliberate, invasive. A few stops later, he got off suddenly, pushing through the door and disappearing into the dark. I exhaled, relief flooding me for a moment before the bus slowed again. At the next stop, that same black sedan was parked, engine idling. The man from the store stepped out, the driver's door opening silently as he slipped inside. The car didn't move immediately. Instead, the driver sat, watching the bus, then looked directly at me through the window. I looked away, heart thudding. The bus driver didn't seem to notice, or maybe he pretended not to. The bus pulled away, leaving the car behind. I thought about telling the driver, but something in his indifferent posture told me it wouldn't make a difference. I got off at my usual spot, an unmarked gravel pull-out near the edge of the woods that led to Mark's place. The path was half covered in overgrowth, tall grass tickling my calves as I walked. The sun had almost slipped away, the sky a bruised mix of purple and gray. I felt exposed, the scent of pine and damp earth oddly comforting but also isolating. Halfway down the trail, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate, matching my pace. I stopped, waiting. The sound stopped a few yards back as well. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps resumed, now crunching the fallen leaves louder. Panic rose in my chest, cold and sharp. I broke into a jog, heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps quickened, matching mine, never gaining, never falling behind. I glanced over my shoulder, still nothing but shadows and tree trunks, twisted and gnarled in the dusk. But the sound was unmistakable. I reached the clearing near the cabin, the porch light casting a weak glow over the peeling paint. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. The door was ajar. I called Mark's name, voice cracking in the cold air. No answer. I stepped inside, clutching my keys like a weapon. The living room was empty, the television off, the silence heavy. On the floor near the doorway lay a single glove, black leather, familiar, but not mine. My breath caught. The glove wasn't Mark's. I picked it up with shaking hands, the leather slick with something dark. I looked down and saw the faintest smear on the floor near it. Red. Fresh. The back door creaked open behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, to see the silhouette of a man slipping inside, face obscured in shadow. I barely had time to react before the heavy weight of him crashed into me, the world tilting in darkness pressing in. When I came to, the door slammed shut, locking behind him. The night had only just begun. The shift ended at midnight, and the hospital parking lot was nearly empty. I slipped into the driver's seat of my car, the cool leather sticky against my sweaty back despite the AC running. I tried to shake off the exhaustion that had settled deep into my bones, but the silence outside felt heavier than usual, like the night was pressing down just a little too hard. I started the engine and pulled out onto the main road, heading home. The streets were deserted except for the occasional street lamp flickering weakly over cracked pavement. A late-night radio show played softly through the speakers, a calm voice narrating a story about a missing hiker in the nearby woods. I tried not to think about it. I had my own way out of the woods tonight, no detours. About 5 miles in, I noticed a dark sedan behind me. It wasn't unusual at first, there were always cars on this stretch, but the same car had been following me for the last few minutes, sticking close enough that I could see the driver's face illuminated by the dashboard lights. A man with a rough beard and tired eyes, but nothing overtly threatening. Still, my pulse quickened. I took a right turn onto a narrower street, a shortcut I used to save a few minutes. The sedan followed without hesitation. My heart picked up. I glanced into the rearview mirror. He was watching me. Not just looking through the window but watching, as if waiting for something. I slowed down, then stopped at a red light at a four-way intersection. The car behind me pulled up as well, close enough that I could make out the license plate, a random mix of letters and numbers, nothing suspicious but somehow not comforting. The man kept his gaze fixed on me, expression unreadable. The light turned green, and I went forward, turning left onto a dimly lit road that cut through an industrial section. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust. I hoped the area was busy enough that if something happened, someone might hear me. The car stayed behind, closer now. I considered pulling over, maybe waiting for someone else's car, but that could make me more vulnerable. I kept driving, turning onto a stretch of road lined with warehouses, the only light coming from a flickering neon sign above a closed bar. The sedan's headlights suddenly went off. The darkness swallowed the car, but I could still hear the engine. My breath caught, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. Why would he turn off his lights at night? Was he trying to hide? Panic threatened to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I spotted a gas station ahead, open late, and pulled in. The area was mostly empty except for the attendant inside, who looked up as I parked under the harsh fluorescent lights. The sedan came in behind me, headlights off, but the man climbed out. He didn't walk toward the store. Instead, he stood by the passenger side, just out of the light. I unlocked my door but didn't move. The attendant glanced outside, probably wondering why I was lingering. I debated calling 911 but was afraid the man would notice, or worse. Suddenly, the man moved into the light. His eyes met mine, cold and unreadable. He nodded once, almost casually, then turned and walked toward the back of the station, disappearing behind the building. I exhaled, heart thudding. I waited for a few minutes more, then carefully pulled out and continued home, glancing in the mirror. No car. No headlights. No sign he was following. When I walked into my apartment, the lock's click felt deafening. I double-checked every door and window, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. What was he doing down there? Why had he followed me? The questions crowded my mind, but there were no answers. I tried to sleep, but every small sound made me jump: the hum of the radiator, the creak of the building settling. Hours later, I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart in my throat, but when I cracked the door open, no one was there. The night stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I wasn't safe, not really. And I knew this was only the beginning. I pulled the door closed with trembling hands and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating. Then, from the hallway, a faint whisper drifted through the crack beneath the door, inaudible words, but unmistakably there. My skin prickled. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear more, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. Minutes passed. I debated fleeing the room, but the idea of stepping into that dim corridor, with shadows lurking just beyond the reach of the weak overhead light, paralyzed me. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the blanket, every nerve screaming in protest. Suddenly, the door handle rattled gently, not enough to open it, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I scrambled away, glancing toward the window, searching for an escape, but the fire escape was too high, unreachable in the dark. The footsteps returned, this time slower, closer, circling the door. A cold breath brushed the other side, and a voice, low and rasping, whispered my name. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The presence hovered for what felt like an eternity before retreating down the hallway, fading into silence. But the dread didn't leave me. In the chilling quiet, I knew I was marked, watched. Whatever this was, it wouldn't let me forget. Not tonight. Not ever. I should have known something was off the moment I pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store. It was late afternoon, the kind of day when the sun is low enough to cast long shadows but not low enough to make it feel like night. The lot was nearly empty, maybe 2 or 3 cars scattered near the entrance, and the whole place felt quieter than usual. I didn't usually shop this late, but the fridge was almost bare, and I figured it was better than rushing after work. The first thing that caught my eye was the man leaning against the blue sedan near the front row. He was staring at me as I parked. I caught his gaze just long enough to notice he had a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. He didn't move when I glanced at him. He just stayed there, watching. I told myself he was probably just waiting for someone, or maybe a smoker taking a break. Still, I felt a prickle of unease that I tried to shake off as I shut the car door and headed toward the store. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the fluorescent lights flickered slightly overhead as if the store itself was tired. The air smelled faintly of bleach and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. I grabbed a basket and started my usual route through the aisles, trying to focus on the shopping list I jotted down on my phone. Milk, bread, eggs, nothing complicated. As I moved into the produce section, I noticed a man standing a few feet away near the apples. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was hard to see under the shadow of the hood, but I caught the outline of his jaw and the way his eyes darted around the store nervously. He wasn't looking at the fruit or the shelves. Instead, he kept glancing in my direction. I pulled my phone out of my pocket under the pretense of checking a message, but I wasn't really texting. I was watching him. After a moment, he turned his back to me and shuffled toward the dairy aisle, but then stopped and looked over his shoulder, as if he thought I was following him. My heartbeat sped up, but I told myself again it was paranoia. Maybe he just recognized me or thought I was someone else. I moved toward the frozen foods, telling myself to pick up the frozen vegetables quickly, but my hands were trembling slightly as I reached for the bag of peas. The store was still mostly empty, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. It was impossible to tell if the two men I'd noticed were working together or not, but the coincidence was too strange to ignore. On my way to the checkout, I saw the first man, the one by the blue sedan, now standing near the exit, blocking the way out. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp and unblinking. I hesitated, my basket feeling suddenly heavier in my hands. I glanced around for an employee or security guard but saw none. The checkout line was short, just 2 people ahead of me, but the cashier seemed distracted, her eyes flicking toward the man by the door every few seconds. When it was my turn, I placed my items on the conveyor belt, the beep of the scanner louder than usual in the empty store. "Do you want a bag?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks." As she packed my groceries, I noticed the door behind her was slightly ajar. Usually, it stayed closed to keep the cold air out. I peeked and saw the parking lot again, but the blue sedan was gone. The man was gone. The cashier's eyes met mine, and I caught a flicker of something in her expression. Fear? Concern? She leaned in and whispered, "Be careful tonight." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" She hesitated, then said, "There's been some weird stuff around here lately. People watching cars, following folks after dark." I laughed nervously, paying for my groceries. "Thanks for the tip." I grabbed my bags and walked toward the exit, my heart pounding louder with every step. Outside, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, and the parking lot was empty again. I scanned the rows of cars but saw no sign of either man. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I got back into my car, I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate. I froze, clutching the keys in my hand. The sound stopped just short of the front bumper, then retreated. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, listening. The lot was silent except for a faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I started the engine and pulled out slowly, glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing. No one. The drive home was tense. Every shadow on the side of the road seemed alive, every passing car a potential threat. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I double-locked the doors and peeked out through the curtains before turning on every light I could find. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe the two men were harmless or that I just caught bad timing. But as I sat on the couch, trying to watch TV, I couldn't ignore the lingering sense of dread settling in my chest. Later that night, I heard a soft tapping on the window, just one tap, then silence. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the dark glass. It could have been a branch or the wind, but the timing was too precise. I didn't sleep much, and when morning came, I found a small scrap of paper slipped under my front door. It was blank. Whatever game this was, it wasn't over.